Hi there, everyone. So I am a day behind. I had my grandbaby yesterday, so yeah, I wasn't able to do day 6. So I'm going to do day 6 now, and I'm gonna play the stream. Just keep an eye on it forward through the breaks and stuff, because I know it's a good time to skip them. There's nothing worse than sitting there waiting for an hour. I will keep an eye on chat to chat with you. I try not to interrupt the stream too much, because I know people do like to obviously watch it without interruption. So this is day 6, and let's see what this will bring for the evidence in this case. And sit back and relax, grab a coffee, and let's see what goes down. Okay, here we go.
Please be seated.
Speed up a little bit for you guys as well. Okay, I am muted.
Remind you that even though you did take your oath yesterday, you are still under oath today. Do you understand that?
I do.
All right, thank you. When we left off yesterday afternoon, at the end of the day, we had been speaking about the DNA profile that you were able to see on specifically the state's exhibit, the pink toothbrush. Do you recall those questions?
I do.
All right. And I believe you had given us a statistic recently about a 1 in 100 sextillion.
That sounds correct.
Okay. And so if you could just clarify one more time for the jury to understand, what does that 1 in 100 sextillion mean in terms of the profile, and comparing the profile that was seen on that toothbrush to the known profiles you were able to generate from Adam Montgomery and Crystal Sorey?
So that's 100 sextillion times the more likely that that toothbrush came from a child from those two particular people than from other random people.
And specifically a female child from those two people, correct?
Correct. It was a female profile.
All right. And so in that profile, and one thing, if you could please explain for the jurors in terms of some of the things when you're looking certainly for differences between males and females when you have an X versus a Y chromosome, if you could explain that to the jurors, what the difference there is.
For the gender?
Yes, please.
Right. So males have an X and a Y, so that everyone is going to get an X from their mother, because females only have 2 X's to give. So when an egg is formed, it's going to have an X regardless. There's no choices. When sperm are formed, half of them are going to get X's and half are going to get Y's from the father. So when they join, you're either going to have an XX and produce a female, or you're going to have an X and a Y and produce a male.
And so with regards to the profile on the toothbrush, because it was identified as being one of a gender female, there was no Y that you saw on that profile. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yes.
It's separate from the toothbrush and being able to come up with that profile and see it there. Separate from that, did you also test a number of different swabs or cuttings as part of your work?
I'm sorry, I did, yes.
Okay. And with regards to those, I'd like to ask you about a couple of specific ones, and by the initials that they came to you under. Specifically, I'd like to ask you about swabs that you received that were labeled JMT 1, 2, 3, and 4.
Okay.
Do you recall being asked to test those?
They sound correct. I do believe one of my reports had those numbers.
If you had a chance to look at that report, would that help?
That would be lovely.
I know you said yesterday, I believe you said you write over 60 of these per year. Is that correct?
Correct. Yes, you may.
So I'm handing you a document. Can you tell me what the document is?
Yes, it's my January 19th, 2022 report. And that's what it is. It's 3 pages of report.
When you generated that particular report, the information fresh in your mind from the work that you just completed on the swaps?
Yes.
So I've asked you to review it at home. And then afterwards, I'm going to ask you a series of questions about A couple of different swabs that you tested on that day. Okay.
Okay, just the JMT 1 through 4 swabs?
Correct.
Okay.
And I see you're looking up. So does that help refresh your recollection on your testing on those 4?
That does.
I wondered if you could talk to us a little bit about the results that you got from those particular swabs. And I'd like to start with swabs JMT 1, 2, and 3. Did you get any results from looking at those swabs?
Right. So 1, 2, and 3, I did get results. They were from more than one person, but there was so little DNA that they were insufficient to be able to make any comparisons. Remember yesterday I talked about when you have a profile, it has to be good enough quality to be able to compare it. And if it doesn't reach a particular threshold, then we can't do any comparisons. That's what happened with those 3 swabs.
And is that the same for all 3 of those swabs? There was just insufficient DNA in all 3 of them?
Yes.
Okay. When you do have a situation like that where it just is insufficient, does that mean that you can draw any sort of conclusions from it one way or another, that it's definitely one individual or definitely not, or that it compares to an unknown person versus a known? Can there be any conclusions drawn?
So we can, usually we can tell, at least if it looks like there was one person or more than one person, which in this case for those, all 3 of those, I said they were more than one person. And sometimes we can tell if there's an X or an X and a Y, and we can tell if at least one of those people is male or female. But in this particular instance, there wasn't enough information to even tell the gender.
And let's stick with those 3 swabs if we can for a minute, JMT 1, 2, and 3. For those swabs, when you did your testing on this, that was testing for DNA analysis, not for general serology. Is that correct?
Correct.
So you don't know, or let me ask you, did you know what sort of substance might be on these swabs or might have been swabbed here?
So I was, when I get the file, I do have information, some cases, some I don't. For these, I did by then know that they were believed to have blood on them.
And with regards to, are you aware of whether or not they went through serological testing at the lab?
So those swabs did not.
They did not.
No.
Okay. And I believe you've done serology at the lab a couple of different times, correct?
Correct.
All right. And with regards to that, what's the name of the test that the lab does for testing for the presence of blood?
Castle-Mayer.
I'd like to move now to JMT4, that last swab. Did you get a different result on JMT4 as compared to 1, 2, and 3?
I did.
And what did you see on JMT4?
I got a profile from one person, and it was a male.
It was from male?
Male, yes.
Not female?
No.
Okay. And let me go ahead and ask you, were there several other swabs that you tested in this matter?
There were.
And from those other swabs, generally from all of them, were you able to come up with any other known profiles or a profile that you saw on any of those that was one that could be compared specifically?
I believe there was one other sample somewhere that had a female profile, if I remember correctly. I don't remember if it was a cutting or a swab of something.
If you had a chance to look at the rest of your reports, do you think that might refresh your recollection as to where that may be?
Yes.
Hand those to you from this over. That particular one that you talked about, that's not within the report that you were reviewing a moment ago, dated January 19th.
No.
Do you recognize the 3 documents I've given you there?
Yes.
And what are they?
My February 1st, 2022 report, my February they're out of order. A June 29th, 2022, and a February 21st, 2023 report.
Would looking at those reports possibly help refresh your recollection as to the other profile that you were able to see?
Yes. Yes.
Feel free for a moment to review. And then
I think I was incorrect. There was a hair that was female, but it was not actually good enough for comparison purposes.
okay, so there was a hair that you looked at, but it was not suitable for comparison purposes.
Right. And everything else, it does look like you're correct. They were not anything that I could compare.
Let me ask, with the work that you did do in this case, at any point did you make anything called a cutting or take a separate sample out of what you had been provided?
I did not.
You did not. Let me just have a moment, please, Your Honor.
Yes.
Ms. Weigel, one more quick series of questions. With regards to the known profiles you were able to develop, not only the one for Adam Montgomery, but also the one for Crystal Sorey, and then with this profile that you were able to see on the toothbrush, the 1 in 100 sextillion. With those three profiles, what were you able to do with that information? Is there a place where that goes, or is there a place where that type of information is shared?
The only place that we would have to share anything would be with the national database, and I believe the profile from the toothbrush was sent to them for the missing persons portion of the database. That's my recollection. That was not something I did, but I believe that is what happened. And then the profile from Adam Montgomery was put into
that database.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ms. Weigel. I don't have any further questions for you. I believe Defense Counsel will have a few.
Okay.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning.
How are you?
Fine.
I do have a few questions, and you clarified a few things for me. Sure, if you don't mind. Okay. Just let me know when you need to look at a report, and then the jury will understand that you're reviewing your report when you testify.
Okay.
So one of your first duties, you said that you had two sort of roles in this case?
For the most part, I did just DNA, but there was one report that I wrote that was serology.
And that was in the beginning of January of 2022.
That sounds correct. I believe I started it actually on the 9th of January that year.
Okay, and that was because a whole bunch of stuff went to another criminalist who normally does serology. So you checked a few things to get them done quickly.
Correct. So all the evidence came in, and they were asked to rush it, and it was a Friday, which is when they all happened to happen. And because I was planning to come in on Sunday, he did what he could on Friday. And on Sunday, I was tasked with trying to get these couple items in particular tested and started for DNA.
Okay, and so one of the things don't simply, let's take swabs where people think the collector thinks it's possible blood. Okay.
Yes.
Somebody at a scene has collected a swab and thinks it's possible blood. Doesn't go right in for a DNA analysis, right?
Not usually, no.
Okay. It often goes to serology for intermediate test to see if there's a presumption that it's blood.
Correct.
And if it turns out that it's presumptively blood, it goes on to the DNA lab.
Correct.
And it may turn out to be DNA and it may not.
Correct.
And then if it is DNA, you may be able to get a profile or you may not.
Correct.
And if you get a profile, it may be sufficient to compare to a known sample or it may not.
Correct.
Okay. So these are all the steps that are generally happening in the lab in a case where swabs and samples go to the DNA lab.
Absolutely, yes.
Okay. And when you did your serology testing in this case, and I think the numbers on them were swabs BEO5 and BEO6.
Yes, they are the correct numbers.
Okay. And one of those swabs was negative for blood.
I believe they were both negative for blood.
Okay. One of those swabs was negative for blood and sent on to the DNA lab.
They were both negative and both sent for DNA.
All right. So let's talk about, let's do them both together. You're right. BEO5 or 6 was negative for blood, but sent on to the DNA lab.
Both of them were negative for blood and were sent to the DNA lab, yes.
Okay, but BEO5.
Those are the correct numbers.
BEO5 was negative for blood and sent to the DNA lab.
Yes.
And then BEO6, you actually got a little more information in your lab, right?
In the DNA portion?
In the DNA portion.
That's the report that he took away. So I think so. But it was not, again, it was still not comparable.
Do you have 19 with you? Okay, so I have messed this up and I don't mean to repeat, but I'm going to back up so that we have it. BEO 5 and 6 were both negative for blood, but sent to the DNA lab.
Correct.
Okay. And at the DNA lab, you got DNA from BEO 6?
I got nothing at all from 6.
Okay.
BEO 6.
So
correct.
here's something that was sent to the lab, found not to be blood, but still sent on to DNA in BEO 6, right?
Yes.
And then in BEO 6, there's no DNA.
Correct.
And then BEO 5 is sent to the lab, found not to be blood, but forwarded on for DNA analysis. And you did find DNA.
I found a small amount of DNA, yes.
And in that small amount of DNA, you found presence of more than one.
That's correct.
And you don't know how many.
Correct.
and you found the presence of at least one of those multiple 2 or more DNAs was male.
Correct.
And the presence of male DNA limited your ability to see female DNA.
That's correct.
So that that mixture could have been 2 males,
Yes.
could have been multiple males,
Yes.
could have been a male and a female,
Yes.
could have been multiple males and females.
Yes.
You just have no idea.
Correct.
So, and I want to talk about some of the reasons that might lead to that insufficiency determination.
Okay.
DNA can degrade over time,
Yes.
and you may 2 years later find DNA or not.
Correct.
And in this case, when you were talking about JMT 1 through 4, were you aware of where those swabs were obtained from?
I don't remember if I did know that at the time when I first started them. I'm not positive if I knew or not.
Okay, the jury has heard some testimony about the collection of those items from a trunk of a Sebring. Does that sound right?
I know that there were definitely samples from the trunk of a car tested, so that would make sense. Yes.
Okay. Now, if DNA is out in an, what do you call the environment that you hold the swab in? Not quarantined.
Room temperature?
Okay.
What are you?
When
I'm
you
not
store
sure.
it so it won't degrade.
Right. So they're just stored usually in envelopes.
Okay.
Mhm.
And are they put in refrigerators or any kind of special environment?
No.
Okay. So when you store it, the DNA can degrade?
It can, but if it's just at room temperature, usually it doesn't.
Okay. But if DNA is out in temperature that could go from very, very hot for a while to very, very cold for a while, it can be subject to degrading.
Correct.
And but at the same time, it can be subject to those swings in temperatures for years and not fully degrade, right?
That's true.
So sometimes some DNA exposed to those extremes in temperatures, you may end up with nothing, or you may end up with something.
That's true.
Because DNA can actually stay around for a long time.
It can.
And it is why even after years have passed, you test for DNA and or blood.
Yes.
Okay. Now the JMT 1, 2, and 3 had the DNA, but they were not sufficient quantity.
Those three. Oh, sorry if I look. I'm
Sure,
the recording.
please.
1, 2, and 3. Right. I could tell that there was more than one person, but that was all that I could tell about those three.
Okay, so again, we have that multiple that you had in BE05, right?
Correct.
And it could have been a male and a male.
I don't know anything about the gender for that sample, whether it was male and male, male and female, female,
Right.
male, etc.
Right. All of those choices apply because there's only 2 genders that are under consideration.
Correct.
Okay. And could have been all of the same gender,
Could have been.
could have been all of mixed gender,
Correct.
could have been 2, could have been more than 2.
It could. Generally, our wording is if we say more than one, it usually means we think it's 2. If we think it's more than 2, we generally would write more than 2, etc. But when it's very low, it is difficult to tell for sure.
Okay. So here it could have been multiple, but what you saw is more than likely 2.
Correct, because it's more than 1, and I did not write that it's more than 2.
Okay.
So yes.
And you tested a fair amount of swabs in your DNA analysis capacity, right?
Correct.
And they were swabs that had the initials MER and various numbers after that.
Correct.
And the jury has learned that the initials are usually the person that collects it, and the number is kind of the order that it gets collected in, right?
That is correct. Yes.
So a fair amount went through serology, something was deemed appropriate to send on for DNA, and then it was tested by you.
Correct.
And you said JMT you knew was from the trunk, or you believed was from the trunk of Sebring,
Correct. I knew there were several things from a trunk of a car. Yes.
and nothing from the interior of the car, right?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
No further questions, Your Honor. Thank you very much. We ask for this witness to be excused, please.
Any objection?
I think not at this time. There's one more criminalist, perhaps, and then I will give an answer.
I think it's a no, Your Honor, so that's
That's a no.
Yeah.
All right, you may step down. You're not excused from this.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're in a distinct house. Scott Riley. Let me just step out to instruct the last witness. You can remain standing and just raise your right hand.
Right, yeah, sorry.
Do you swear the testimony that you're about to provide this jury will be the truth and the whole truth under the pains and penalties of perjury?
I do.
Can I just have a seat and make a motion?
Good morning.
To push that.
Good morning, Detective Riley. How are you today?
Oh, well, good morning.
And sorry, I just referred to you as a detective. Mr. Riley, can you begin by stating and spelling your full name for the record?
Scott Riley, SCOTTRILEY,
And what city or state do you live in?
Manchester, New Hampshire.
How long have you lived in Manchester?
On and off my whole life.
About how old are you?
I'll be 53 this year.
Mr. Riley, how are you presently employed?
Employed, but I work for myself. I'm a consultant for, I do some work for some civil law firms.
Is that, what kind of work is that?
Interviewing.
Investigations?
No investigations, just interviews. I just do like a forensic type interview.
Do you do anything else currently?
I still work at the police department part-time.
And let's talk about that. When you say you still work at the police department part-time, what police department is that?
Manchester.
And can you just walk the jurors through your experience working at the Manchester Police Department?
So you want me to start with my first police department and then move into Manchester, or just Manchester?
Manchester.
So Manchester, I went there in 2007, and I spent, I think, maybe 7.5 years in Manchester in patrol, doing all kinds of different assignments, bike patrol, motorcycles, stuff like that. And then I went into the juvenile division as a school resource officer for a couple of years, and then I spent the remaining almost 8 years as a juvenile detective.
What kind of things did you do as a patrol officer?
Respond to urgent calls, anything from traffic stops to urgent, could be bank robberies, anything, whatever's needed at the time.
And is it pretty typical for officers that start at the Manchester Police Department to work patrol for some period of time?
Yes, it is.
You mentioned going into the juvenile division and working as a school resource officer.
I did.
How long specifically did you do that for?
2.5 years. If I don't know exact. I think it was maybe 2.25 years, 2.5 years, somewhere around there.
And you also mentioned eventually becoming a detective in the juvenile division.
I did.
What did you do? What were your assignments and duties in that role?
Investigating crimes either against or by juveniles.
And how long were you a detective with that division?
It was just shy of 10 years, by a few months.
Earlier, you mentioned prior law enforcement experience prior to the Manchester Police Department. Can you tell the jurors what that is?
I worked at Hooksett Police Department. That's where I was originally hired in 2004. I worked there from 2004 to 2007. Then I transferred over to Manchester.
Mr. Riley, did you graduate from the New Hampshire Police Academy?
I did.
What year did you graduate?
The 135th Academy, and it was in 2004.
I want to switch gears, Officer Riley. I'm sorry, Mr. Riley.
I'm still an officer, so it's okay.
Okay. Can you, were you assigned duties in your capacity as a law enforcement officer in the investigation of the missing child, Harmony Montgomery?
I was.
And can you just describe generally your role and involvement on that case?
It began with everybody pretty much in the division, because when I first came in, it was fast paced. They kind of grabbed everybody they could to work on it. So the assignments in the beginning were kind of just they'd have like a morning meeting and they would decide you're doing this today. There was nothing specific. And then it morphed into, I was assigned monitoring jail calls, jail mail, jail messages. I was involved in some interviews. I mean, I didn't have like a specific assignment. Whatever was needed, they just assigned it to us and kind of we ran with
Did you
it.
say it was all hands on deck?
It was in the beginning, yes.
I mentioned a missing persons investigation. Did that change at some point during the course of your involvement?
It did. Yeah.
What did it change to?
It changed to more of a homicide investigation.
Do you recall when your involvement began on the Harmony Montgomery case?
I believe it was the 2 days after Christmas, so it would have been the 12/27 of 2021, if I recall correctly.
At some point in the investigation, did you and the officers with the Manchester Police Department receive information pertaining to the Families in Transition Shelter, FIT shelter here in town?
We did.
And what led you? What information did you receive that led you to that shelter?
I wasn't part of there was an interview that was conducted and information was obtained that maybe the child was placed in that apartment for a period of time.
You mentioned an interview being conducted. Was that with Kayla Montgomery?
It was.
During your time with the Manchester Police Department, were you tasked with processing that room?
I was.
When did you process that room?
I believe that was June 4th of 2022, if I recall correctly.
Can you describe your response to the Families in Transition Shelter that day?
We were told to go out there and we were going to complete a search of the apartment. I mean, the crime scene van was involved. It wasn't my case, so I didn't really have any of the planning. I was just kind of, let's go. You're going to help process the scene, and we obviously went out there.
So you mentioned receiving information pertinent to your investigation that may be at the Families in Transition Shelter. Did you subsequent to that, after getting that information, did you provide a subpoena for documents to the Families in Transition Shelter?
I did.
If I can approach, Your Honor.
Yes, you may. Yes, you may.
So, Mr. Riley, I'm handing you what's been marked as State's Exhibit 93 for identification. I'm just going to ask that you review those items. In specific attention to this page and this page. Are you aware of what those documents?
I am. I've never actually read these, but I'm aware of what they are. Yes.
Okay. Your Honor, the state moves to strike ID of State's Exhibit 93 and mark the scope.
You just do it. Okay. So not your whole-
Sorry.
and overruled in part.
Your Honor, it's my move to publish State's Exhibit 93.
No objection.
I'm gonna leave these with you, Mr. And I'd just like to walk through what those documents are with the jury. If you could start with the first page, the room information. Feel free to use the screen behind you. Do you see the individual's name in the top left?
Yes.
Can you read it yours?
Montgomery,
In what room does it say Adam Montgomery was staying?
room 1,
And what were the dates associated with this?
December 30th, of 2019 through February 20th of 2020.
Let's go to the next document. This is work order number 811010. What is the start date of that document?
2/5 of 2020.
What's your understanding of what this document is?
It's the work order for the fit.
And can you read the description on that work order?
It says general other, really cold in units 2 and 5. Come check the thermostat, slate odor when the heat is on. Done on 2/5 of 20.
And what was the unit number associated with that?
Unit 2.
And we'll talk about this later, but are you familiar with the general layout of the rooms in the fish office?
Yes.
And let's move to work order number A11079. Which unit number is associated with that work order?
Unit 1.
And that's your understanding of where the defendant was staying.
Correct.
And can you read the general description?
General other, weird smell coming from beds in the unit. Come check it out.
What was the date associated with?
February 21st of 2020.
And you mentioned earlier that the defendant left that room on February 20th.
Correct.
So this is the day after you left.
Correct.
We may approach your honor. Dr. Riley, I'm handing you what's been marked and previously published as State's Exhibits 31 through 34, and what's been marked for identification as State's Exhibits 35 through 39 for identification. Can you take a look at each of those in turn? I'm going to take these records back. Can you take a look at each of those in turn and describe what's depicted on those images?
This is the. Are you gonna put them on the screen too? You want me to?
I plan to put them on the screen, but if you can just talk to me about.
Okay.
Not sure the drawing.
Okay, so the first picture is a picture of the front of the families in transition, which I'm going to call fit for ease. It's the front door. It's really just the front of the building. And the second is second picture is
Hold on. Attorney Knowles, him saying second picture, I need him to identify what he's looking at by the exhibit number, please.
Just review the number that's depicted at the bottom.
is it this number right here?
Yep.
Okay, so number 30 is the front of the building. Number 31 is inside the building, looking at doors, apartments 1 and 2. Number 32 is looking inside unit 1. It's the picture inside the room. Number 33 is another picture inside the room, specifically of the ceiling. Number 34 is a picture of the vent, our area of interest, one of them. Number 35 is a picture above the ceiling, looking at the an area of interest that I'm sure we're going to talk about shortly. Number 36 is I had placed a measuring tape to kind of show the size of the area of our interest up there. And then number 37 is a picture of the ceiling was cut. It was on the floor before they wrapped it.
How about 30, 39, 38. 39, and 39.
So 38 is another picture of the ceiling when it was on the floor. It was placed on butcher paper.
39A.
39A is a picture after I cut the ceiling, just the hole and picture of the room. And then 39B is another picture of the ceiling where I cut out the ceiling.
And do you recognize the items?
I do.
Are they accurate representations of what you saw that day?
They are.
At this point, Your Honor, I move to strike the ID from State's exhibits 35 through 39B.
Not 30 through 34, just 35 through 39B.
30 through 34 have been previously published.
I see, okay. Any objection? All right, the ID is stricken, they're entered as full exhibits.
Detective Riley, when you arrived at the Families in Transition Shelter, were you accompanied by anyone that day?
Many people, yes.
And you mentioned remembering going there. The image that I've just depicted behind you, identified as State's Exhibit 30. Do you recognize that location?
That's the front of the fit, yes.
And the individuals that accompanied you that day, do you remember their names?
Some of them.
Okay.
Detective Stewart Coswick, Ray Hill, Deputy Duffs, William Duffs is his name. Tufts, I'm sorry, Tufts. Detective Dunleavy. There's a couple supervisors there, I think.
So the individuals that you just mentioned, the majority of them work for the Manchester Police Department.
Yes, all but one. Yes.
Are you aware of where Deputy Tufts that you mentioned?
U.S. Marshals.
Mr. Riley, what did you do when you arrived at the Families in Transition Shelter, FIT shelter? You mentioned that you did some cutting as you were reviewing those images. Can you tell the jurors what you actually did?
So you want me to start from my first observation when I walked in the room or just the actual cutting?
Let's talk about walking into the room first. If you'll look at the image that's on the screen behind you, State's Exhibit 31. What are we looking at there?
Unit 1 and 2.
So
Doors.
Unit 1. I don't know that that's much better, but
This is 01.
so Unit 1 is on the left. And where's Unit 2?
Right here on the right.
Over there, adjoining rooms.
Yes. They're polar opposites of each other. I'm pretty sure they're exactly opposite like this. The walls are right into.
I'm sorry, Your Honor.
Oh, yeah, sir, you just need to speak into the microphone
sorry.
when you're speaking,
Yep.
so that everyone can hear you. I know it's hard, but
And did you make any impressions when you, did you enter the room when you arrived?
I did.
And the image that's behind you, you said you recognized.
That's Unit 1.
And was that the layout that day?
It was.
Are you aware of whether or not they're allowed to move furniture at the Families in Transition?
I have no idea.
Tenants?
Not aware.
But that's what you saw when you arrived.
Yes.
And again, can you remind us why you were going there that day?
There was information developed in the investigation that there's a potential that the missing file was placed above the ceiling in this unit.
And was there an access point to that ceiling?
There was.
And do you see it in the image there?
I did. It was the vent at the top.
That vent?
That's correct.
There's a number next to that vent. Can you read that to the jurors?
Number 1.
When you arrived in that room, when you actually walked in, did you make any impression? Did you have any impressions?
I did.
Can you tell the jurors what those impressions
There was an odor. I could smell something. I didn't know what it was when I first entered the room, but I could tell there was an odor in the room.
Okay. Any other impressions, Detective?
I mean, it looked lived in. Kind of a normal residence, I guess.
Did you do anything with that vent while you were there?
I did.
What did you do with it?
I removed the vent. I pushed it up into the ceiling and moved it to the side.
Was there anything securing that vent when you moved it?
I don't believe there's anything securing the vent to the outside frame. The vent kind of just sits into the outside frame, but the vent was connected to some tubing up top by a zip tie.
Did you remove that zip tie at some point?
Yeah, yes, I did after.
What did you observe did you look into the opening that you
I did.
created?
I
What
did.
you observe when you,
As soon as I removed the cover, I knew I could smell what I know is decomposition. I knew I could smell a dead body, what I believed to be a dead body at the time, or it smelled like decomposition is the best way to describe it.
What is decomposition?
Person dies, their body starts to degrade, I guess is the best word. It's a smell that you just won't forget.
And can you just tell the jurors what your experience is with that smell?
I mean, I've been to many many death scenes, many autopsies. I've smelt it many times.
Did you make any other observations when you looked into that vent?
I did.
And what were those?
I could see at first that there was it looked like a stain right close to the edge of the vent. That correct? And I also noted that you can see the sheetrock dust. And I'm sorry if you can't hear me. This is hard to crank my neck around to see this. The sheetrock dust you could tell had been altered. Like you could see in the back, it's all fresh sheetrock dust, probably from when it over here appeared to have been something had been in that area.
Mr. Riley, if you don't mind just standing up and actually pointing to that area of dusting that you're discussing.
Right here, you can see here. This is different. The composition is very different between the two. It was clear that something was here and not placed over in this area.
And the staining that you mentioned, where is that? If you could point it out on the screen.
I'm sorry, say that again.
You mentioned seeing staining.
Yes.
Where is that on the? At some point, did you attempt to measure what you were observing in that picture?
To the best, yes, I did.
And is that it?
It is
About 16 inches across?
approximately. It varied in size.
Let's talk about what you did next after you observed this area of interest. What did you do?
As a team, we obviously decided that we needed to take this, so we cut it. We used just an old school sheetrock serrated knife, and I cut the sheetrock until I got to the metal studs, and then we had to use a reciprocating saw to cut the metal studs you can see in the picture.
Did you take any precautions while you were working on the ceiling?
When I was up in there, I had gloves on, but I didn't go up into the ceiling. You couldn't because it would collapse. So I didn't really have, other than putting the measuring there, I didn't really have any direct involvement with like the stain. When I started cutting, we changed gloves every time we changed, like when we took the vent down, we changed gloves. When we started cutting, I changed gloves. But I was below the ceiling at this point. I was cutting from below. I wasn't up in the ceiling with it.
Were you wearing a hazmat suit that day, or
I was
mask?
not.
How about a mask?
I was not.
What were your working conditions like while you were doing this?
It was hot.
It was hot.
It was hot. It was very hot.
Sweating.
I was.
How long did it take? You said you removed a portion of the ceiling. How long did that take?
I would say the actual cutting was probably maybe an hour. The whole time we were up there was maybe, or dealing with that, maybe 3 hours. I don't recall the exact times, but it was within a couple hours, I think, probably from the time we removed the vent till the time we actually took the ceiling down.
And so you mentioned actually taking the ceiling down. Is that what it looked like?
It is.
And again, that staining, did it become more apparent once you removed it from the dark area it was in?
It did because of the lighting. It was.
Do you recall whether that item was given an evidence number?
I know it was. It wasn't tagged by me. My primary focus was just getting it down, and then it was handed off to the team that packaged it and tagged it. I'm helping assisting packaging later, but initially they put it and covered it in butcher paper.
Do you recall having it labeled MER3D?
That sounds right. Yes.
MER, those are initials this jury heard. Do you know whose initials those are?
Yeah. Detective Rayhill.
That's Max Rayhill.
Correct.
You mentioned butcher paper.
Yes.
Do you see that in this image?
Yes. You can see it through the hole. It's sitting on top of butcher paper.
At what point during your processing did you actually place that butcher paper down?
I didn't place it down. The team that was there did. I was standing on. I had the ceiling. I'm not very tall, so I had to stand on the platform to get to cut. So once we got to the point that I could cut the last metal, we had to have other team members hold it. And then once it was detached from the ceiling, I got out of the way and it was put down on a piece of paper.
Do you know what the purpose was of putting it on paper?
Preserve any evidence that's on it or in it.
Would that be including the items that fell during the cutting?
Correct.
Are you aware of how this portion of the ceiling was handled once you removed it?
I know it was placed in the crime scene van, and then I believe I helped carry it up into the evidence room. And then I didn't have anything to do with it for a period of time after that.
Were you aware of low points in the ceiling while you were processing it?
I don't know what you mean by low points.
Was it completely level, or do you know?
On the outside, looking up, it was inside. There was a bunch of different channels because of the metal framing.
I want to talk about how large the ceiling was relative to the overall room size. You documented it, is that right?
I did.
And is that accurate in comparison?
It is.
How did you actually get up there to cut this out?
We used that bed frame.
No ladder?
Nope. Well, we had a ladder there as well because we had to have multiple people, but I stood on that bed frame, and if I recall, I may have stepped off to the ladder. And I know there was some talk about having other people jump in because it was hot that day and it was a lot of manual cutting, but I continued, and just because I was already covered in sheetrock dust, there was no sense getting everybody else.
Mr. Raleigh, I want to switch gears. At some point, in your official capacity as an officer with the Manchester Police Department, did you travel to Florida?
I did.
Can you explain that to the jurors, why you did that?
They're trying to figure out how to get this to a lab to test it for DNA or try to figure out what was on this staining. And I know that I didn't myself, but another detective had done some work on this prior to me getting it. I offered to drive it down to Florida because they had no, it was too big. You couldn't fit it in a plane. It was just, it turned into a mess. So I offered to drive it, and they said, sure. So I went and rented a car at the airport. And I know that the size, I remember it being 44 inches wide, and we had to find a vehicle that it would fit in. So we rented the car and it fit, and we drove straight to Deerfield Park, Florida. I think it's DNA Labs is the name of the.
DNA Labs International?
Yes, correct.
And when you say we drove it, who, if anyone, were you accompanied with?
Detective Bergeron Rosa.
And so you drove it from Manchester to Florida?
We did.
And do you recall the date of that?
I believe that was July 20th of 2022, if I recall correctly.
Did you stay in Florida, or did you come back to New Hampshire?
We stayed overnight. We drove straight through. We didn't sleep on the way down. We drove the whole way.
In your career as an officer, have you ever done something like that, such a long trip?
Personally, yes, many times. As a police officer, no.
Did you eventually come back with that item, that portion of the ceiling?
We did.
And when you say we did, was that with Adam Bergeron Rosa, or was that another officer?
That was with Detective Heil. Yes. Just the timing thing, so they decided him to go.
And how did you come back with the item?
We flew down, we rented a car, or it was a Ford Expedition, if I remember correctly, and we came back with that amongst many, many other items. It wasn't just that item, but the vehicle was completely full.
Between the time that you took possession of the portion of the ceiling and the time that you got to the lab in Florida, were you able to maintain and secure possession of that item at all times?
At all times, yes.
And once you obtained it back from the lab in Florida and drove it back to New Hampshire, were you able to contain it, to secure it at all times?
We were.
If I can have just a moment. No further questions. Thank you.
Just a few, but I think I have.
Oh. I'll be able to use this now. It was just hard to turn around.
Doesn't have to go high. Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm Caroline Smith, and I do not have very many questions, but you talked about having many different duties in this case, right?
Correct.
And one of those duties was to talk with Kayla Montgomery.
Yes.
And do you recall when you were speaking with Kayla Montgomery?
I would say either the 30th of December or the I think 12/30 of 2021 is. I may be wrong, but that's kind of in my head.
Okay. Was that at the Fit Shelter or a recorded interview?
Both. So I talked to her 2 different times, so that may be off by a day. The first time I believe I talked to her. We were at Fit, outside of Fit.
And the second time?
Was at the station.
Okay. And that was a recorded interview?
Correct.
And that was prior to her arrest?
Correct.
Okay. Did you advise her that she could have an attorney?
Yes.
And did you tell her that she didn't have to speak? You wanted to talk to her about missing Harmony?
Yes. I don't know if I did or Detective Dunleavy, but she was advised that it was a voluntary interview. Yes.
Okay. And you talked for a while.
Yeah. Yes, it was. It was
And
pretty
then at
lengthy.
some point, I think you all gave her a chance to be alone and write down maybe her thoughts.
Correct.
In case she didn't want to tell you all directly, maybe she wanted to write it down and pull her thoughts together.
That is correct.
Right?
Yes.
And the essence is that and you gave her a fair amount of time, right?
Yes.
And when you came back and looked at the note, it essentially ended the interview.
It did.
Okay. Now, another random duty. I don't mean to call it random. You just
It
were
was.
jumping here, there, and
It
everywhere,
was very
right?
random.
And
Okay.
one of the things that you did was, sorry, to collect something from the House of Correction that Kayla wrote.
Correct.
Show you what's been marked as Exhibit G. Do you recognize this document?
It's okay to remove it out of here?
Yes.
Okay. I do recognize it.
What is it?
It's a note that she had, that was, I think they were doing a cell search, if I recall correctly, and they found this in her room,
Okay.
in her cell, sorry.
Okay, and so essentially, the police department, someone discovered that this note had been seized,
Yes,
and you were assigned to go and take the note.
correct.
And did you talk to the COs and sort of document everything about how that was obtained?
Yes, they had their own report. They provided me with their inside report.
Okay, and do you recall when that was?
I don't, I'd have to see the report. I don't remember the date. I'm guessing early January. I don't recall the date. I have to see it.
If I showed you a copy of a report, would that help
It
refresh
would,
your
it would,
recollection?
it would. Just too many dates to try to
I know.
wrap my head around them. So it was January 31st of 2022.
Okay, and, excuse me, from the time that you obtained that note, did you put it into evidence and secure it and all that stuff?
I did.
Okay. And just very, very quickly, I want to talk about securing evidence and why you do it, okay?
Yes.
And why you have these initials and all these bags and stuff. You can't do anything about evidence and what happens and who touches it and how it might get transferred and all that stuff until you collect it, right?
Correct.
If you want to preserve something in the exact condition that you want it to be in, you can't affect what happened before, right?
That's correct.
So all you can do is take what you have available, and from that moment, you can preserve it.
Correct.
Any changes an item might have gone through, any transfer of evidence back and forth, you can't affect that.
I cannot.
But from the moment that you collect it, you're gonna make sure that there's virtually no changes in that item, right?
Correct.
And one of the ways that you do it is to collect it and put it in a container.
Correct.
Okay, it might be something like an evidence bag,
Could be.
and it might be something more, it might be an envelope if it's just a document.
Could be. Yes.
And in that one, you put it in that clear evidence bag?
I believe this was their evidence bag, but I don't recall if it's ours or theirs. This doesn't look like our bag, but it may have been. We have many different types, so I don't recall if this was mine or theirs.
Okay,
It probably was ours because I believe I took copies of this, so I believe this would be our bag. I may be
okay.
mistaken.
And that's a plastic bag.
It is.
So you try and collect it and preserve it in the container appropriate for that evidence.
Sure.
For instance, you wouldn't put the tile in plastic because that might cause
Condensation.
condensation and affect the condition of the item within there, right?
Sure,
So
yes.
you're not so worried about condensation with a piece of paper.
Correct.
Okay. And then when you collect it, the jury has seen items open and it has red tape. This one is sealed just as a product of the bag it's contained in, right?
Correct.
But other evidence items might have some tape on it.
Sure.
And the reason for the tape is that you are securing the evidence and letting anybody know, once this is taped, that nothing is going to change that item unless we can track it, right?
Sure.
For instance, if evidence has been taped with Manchester Police Department tape, then something might be sent to the lab for checking, right?
Sure.
And the lab would have to open an item to test an item, right?
Correct.
And so when the lab opens whatever packaging that you have retained a piece of evidence in, they actually don't open from the top, right?
I don't do that. I have no idea how they open it.
Foundation.
Sustained.
Okay, so one of the purposes of the different color tapes is to be able to track when an item of evidence has been opened from its packaging.
I use whatever color tape is available. I don't use it for tracking. I use it to seal the item. It's the only reason I do it.
Okay, so if somebody comes along later and opens the item, they have to reseal it to indicate that it's been gone in and then keep the tracking. You don't do that?
Overruled.
I don't reopen evidence. I don't know that I mean, I guess
Okay.
it's possible it could happen, but I wouldn't necessarily use a different color tape if I did.
Okay.
I would cut it in a different area. I would tape it and then initial it after.
Okay. So you would cut it in a different area so that somebody knows that it has been opened from the original ceiling.
Sure.
And then you would tape it in that second area, right?
Sure.
And you would do a report that documented the fact that for whatever reason you had to go into the bag that contained the item of evidence.
Sure.
So that anybody that wants to know, has there been any changes to this item of evidence, we can track anybody who has had access
It's
to it.
reasonable. Yes.
Okay. But there's nothing you can do about anything before you collect an item of evidence.
Correct.
Okay. Thank you, Officer.
Yes, officer.
Officer Riley, you were asked about interviewing Kayla Montgomery, and you mentioned that interview ended.
It did.
Can you tell the jurors why that interview ended?
She said that she didn't want to talk anymore and she wanted to get an attorney.
She asked for a lawyer.
She did.
Note G, Exhibit G, that note that was collected. Are you sure about who collected it, who put it in that plastic bag?
I think I would have because I believe I took photocopies. I don't recall if I did photocopies or they gave me photocopies. That's why I'm unsure whether I put it in that bag or someone else.
When you say they may have given you photocopies, you also said it may have been their bags. Who's they?
The
They that you're referring
Valley
to?
Street Jail, Hillsborough County House of Corrections.
Note G also talks about her wanting to speak to her attorney, right?
Correct.
You were asked about the handling of evidence, packaging. You were asked about cross-contamination. Do you know what cross-contamination is?
Yes.
Can you tell the jurors what cross-contamination is?
Well, it depends on the item of evidence, but I mean, cross contamination could be anything from blood to DNA to. I mean, I'm not sure what.
Specifically with respect, and let me back up. You were asked about tiles. Did you collect tiles from that fit shelter?
Tiles. They were collected. Yes, I didn't physically collect them, but yes, they were collected.
You collected the ceiling,
Yes,
and this wasn't ceiling tiles. This was the actual ceiling.
this was a drywall. Yes,
Do you remember what the drywall was connected to?
it was connected to metal studs, metal framing.
Metal framing.
Yes.
So that's what you collected.
Yes.
After that collection, did you volunteer a DNA sample?
If needed, yes, I did.
Why was that?
Because it was sweating so much it was nearly impossible to try to measure and take pictures of that stain. I mean, it was just the sweat was running down my face, so I wasn't sure if I could have sweat and dropped any in that opening when I was up in there.
Is that pretty standard when you're collecting items of evidentiary value, of potential evidentiary value, that you volunteer such a thing?
Yes.
And that's for many detectives, right?
Yes.
I don't have any additional questions. Thank you.
Sorry. The prosecutor asked about how the December 31, 2021 interview ended, and with that note, and you said that Kayla asked for an attorney?
Is that the recorded interview?
Yeah.
Yes. Yes, she said it. She wrote in the note that she wanted an attorney. Yes.
Okay, but the note contained a lot more than I want an attorney. The note contained what she said
Yeah. What
the
did it-
story was.
Yes.
That Adam had driven off with Harmony and she
Approach.
Hi guys that have just joined. I'm just on mute. I don't like to disturb the hearing too much, so I just kind of let you guys listen in. I hope everyone is well.
So the note that essentially entered the interview included that she wanted a lawyer, right?
Correct.
But it also included that she didn't know anything more. Go talk to Adam. He wouldn't talk to.
Yes.
Sorry about my misreference to the ceiling tiles.
So it's
And again, that volunteer of the DNA sample is a lot of stuff can affect an item. And you want to make sure if there's an item of evidence that is revealing information that nobody understands, that they can check your DNA, compare and see maybe it's that versus something else.
Correct.
If there's a question about perhaps DNA being found.
Correct.
Okay. And by the way, note G that you collected from the COs. You remember that?
Yes.
Okay. That was not the note we're talking about in the interview. That was the note where Kayla had listed her desires in talking to the AGs.
Correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Let me step down. Yes. Our mid-morning break. It's about 10:33, so just after quarter of, we'll come back and resume the evidence. Thank you for your attention. All of my instructions apply today as well, so don't talk about the case, please. Thank you. All rise for the jurors, please. All right, 15 minutes, so 12 for you all. can he stay during cross and
Absolutely.
Do
I
the-
think that's
do the
way
same
to
thing.
do it, is to be impartial in terms of his ability to assist the jury in understanding.
so if you want him, if you don't, I'll leave that to you, Attorney Smith, but he'll be available to help manage the larger pieces of evidence if you want that, okay? All right, that's fine. Maybe just introduce him. You know, he's not testifying, but I think it might be useful for them to know who he is. Okay, very good. All right, ready to bring in the jurors? Everybody ready?
Yes, Your Honor, sorry.
Becca, does that fit through there with that table? I guess maybe they'll take it out of there. The cart, yeah. The cart will fit? Yeah. Okay. You may be seated. State may call its next witness.
Yes, Your Honor. The state calls Raymond Lammy.
In addition, Your Honor, we'd like to call evidence technician David Dido simply to be able to assist with the handling of physical evidence, not to testify.
Any objection?
Not objection.
And Detective Fleming, if you can just remain standing, raise your right hand. Do you swear the testimony that you're about to provide this jury will be the truth and the whole truth and the means and penalties of perjury?
I do.
You can have a seat, make yourself comfortable. There's some water there. And Detective Lemmy, if you can get started by just stating and spelling your full name for the record.
Ray Lammy, Lamy.
And Detective Lemmy, how are you presently employed?
I'm currently employed as a detective with the Manchester Police Department.
How long have you worked as a detective?
I've been a detective a little over 5.5 years.
And what's your current assignment?
My primary function is fraud investigation, and I also am a lead in crime scene processing.
What are your current duties and responsibilities, Detective Lemmy?
General investigations of any financial crime from start to finish. When it comes to any major crimes in the city, violent crimes, then we all lend a hand and process those and work on those together.
Have you ever had any other roles at the Manchester Police Department?
I was a patrol officer for just about 5 years.
And prior to that, any law enforcement experience?
2 years in Litchfield as a police officer.
Did you graduate from the New Hampshire Police Academy?
I did class 163, approximately February, March of 2014.
Detective Lemmy, do you participate in regular training as a function of your role with the Manchester Police Department?
I do.
Generally, what types of training have you completed?
Notwithstanding a litany of financial crime investigations, I've done forensic identification of skeletal remains, blood stain pattern analysis, crime scene processing, death investigations, FARO certified, and crime scene photography.
You mentioned the FARO just now. Can you tell the jurors just generally what that is?
A FARO is a 3D device that can map out an area, which is useful for documenting measurements and recreating a scene for the jury, such as yourself.
I want to switch gears, Detective Lemmy. Were you working in your official capacity as a detective, rather? Were you assigned to a particular case involving a missing child, Harmony Montgomery?
Yes.
And can you just generally describe your role and participation in that case?
Majority of my role was helping coordinate evidence processing, liaison between the state lab and private labs, processing of several vehicles for evidence, and also some other various items that were processed.
Did you coordinate with a lab in Florida during your participation?
I did.
And when did your involvement begin?
Beginning of January, we had some initial tips that were phoned in that we went and investigated in Haverhill, Mass. And then a vehicle was processed middle to the end of January.
You mentioned the beginning of January. Do you remember what year that was?
2022.
You mentioned tips, and I want to discuss that. Are you aware of a tip line related to the disappearance of Harmony Montgomery?
Yes, I am.
Had you worked in your career as a law enforcement officer, as a detective, had you worked on a case involving a tip line before?
I've had tips come in for some of my own cases and financial crimes.
I guess I'm referring to a specified tip line associated with this case.
I did not field the tips or the calls. I was just asked to follow up on them.
You were directed to follow up on them?
Correct.
And you said one of those was in, did you say Haverhill, Mass?
Yes.
You mentioned processing vehicles
Mhm.
during your participation in this case. Was one of those vehicles a blue Audi AS4 bearing New Hampshire registration number 4569334?
I can tell you that it was an Audi AS4 blue. I can't tell you the exact plate without referencing my notes.
Your Honor, if I may, excuse me, if I may approach.
Yes.
Detective Lemmy, I'm handing you what's been previously published as State's Exhibit 22 for identification. Or for
Yep.
You
I do recognize that vehicle. It's the one that I processed here at Manchester Police Department, New Hampshire plate 4569334.
and that's the Audi that you processed.
Yes.
Were you working with other officers or detectives during the processing of that vehicle, Detective Lemmy?
I was.
And how many days roughly did it take for you to process that vehicle?
The physical processing of the vehicle took about 3 days, and then there were additional days after that processing the evidence that we took out of it.
Was it consistent? Excuse me. Was it consistent with individuals that were assisting you during your processing of that vehicle, or did the numbers change?
The numbers changed a little bit.
Do you know a Detective Heil?
Yes.
How about a Detective Pittman?
Yep. The two of them and I were responsible the first day of basically inventorying the vehicle, identifying the majority of the evidence items that we pulled out.
And this jury has already heard about the initial processing as you take in evidence. But Detective Pittman, do you know what his initials were? Or are?
JP.
And the items that you collected from that vehicle, were they processed under a specific set of initials?
Yes, JP.
About how many pieces of evidence, potential evidence, were labeled with initials during your time working in that body?
I would say it's approximately 271.
Separate from that, did you use any testing during your processing of that Audi?
Yeah. After the first round of testing, or the first round of processing the vehicle, a few items were tested with a method known as a hemistick. And a hemistick basically is a reagent on a strip that, when comes in contact with hemoglobin, will turn a dark green.
Did you test all 271 items using a hemistick?
No, we did not.
Why not?
We essentially looked at the items on what appeared to have potential for yielding some type of blood or DNA.
Are you aware of false positives occurring with the use of a hemistick?
Yes, I am.
And can you explain that to the jury, please?
The reagent on the hemistick can get false positives, which will trigger it to appear to react as if it came in contact with hemoglobin, which is found in blood. And some of the items that can do that are potato, tomato, iron. They can give you what you would think to be a positive, but it ends up being a false positive.
Because of false positives, Detective Lemmy, when you see something that's presumptively positive, what do you do with it?
Well, presumptive positive is just an indicator that it could have hemoglobin. So we treat everything as if it has the chance to have that. In this particular case, the items that tested positive were sent up to the New Hampshire State Lab for processing.
And I guess let me ask this, do you take additional swabs to send up to the New Hampshire State Lab?
Depending on the item, I believe in this case, the items were small enough that we were able to send the whole item up to the lab.
On this particular vehicle, where did you use the hemisticks?
In the back seat, there was a car part just randomly sitting on the seat, and it was plastic with car insulation, like sound and deadening insulation on it. And there were a couple of spots on that looked suspicious that I tested.
How would you describe, excuse me, how would you describe the condition of the vehicle when you examined it?
So the vehicle had what appeared to be, and we didn't test it, but it smelled like it, appeared to have a thick layer of mold all throughout the inside of the passenger compartment.
And you previously mentioned working on that vehicle for several days. Did you take any precautions because of that?
We wore Tyvek suits, and also not wanting to breathe in mold, we wore a face mask.
Of the items that were pulled from that vehicle, did you send any off to the state laboratory?
I did.
And do you remember which items you submitted?
The first 3 items that we did initially were, I believe, JP 55, which was the car part, JP 120, and JP 122, which were carpeted floor mats.
Do you recall submitting item JP 119, 153, 195, 224, 251, 216, 225 to the lab as well?
So those were sent several days or a week later when we processed outside of the vehicle area. And I actually used a different testing method for that one.
What was that testing method?
So I transitioned from the Hemistick to Kastle-Meyer, which is a similar type of test. It's processing using reagents to also identify hemoglobin. But the Kastle-Meyer historically has been known to provide less false positives. So I transitioned to that and processed approximately 37 items that had come out of the car. And out of that, I believe 6 gave me a presumptive positive, and 1 was a false positive.
When you say that 1 was a false positive, how did you determine that?
So, and not to get too technical, but the way the test works is you drop 3 drops on a swab. So the swab is used to collect the evidence off of the item. Sometimes it's a dry swab, sometimes it's a drop that's been dipped in sterile water. You rub it on the evidence item, then you drop a couple of drops of what's called phenolphthalein onto the swab. If the swab immediately reacts with just those initial drops, that's considered a false positive, because until you add a couple of drops of hydrogen peroxide, 3%, onto the item, it shouldn't react at all. So in one of the cases, it reacted as soon as I dropped the first couple of phenolphthalein drops onto it.
Excuse me. You mentioned this green color when you're using Hemistix.
Mhm.
Is there a color associated with the Kastle-Meyer test?
Yes, Kastle-Meyer will turn to bright pink.
And is there a different level of pink that you're looking for, or is it something else?
It's not so much the level with the Kastle-Meyer test as it is the time frame of how long it takes to react. So if it reacts immediately, it's a stronger indicator that it's a true positive.
Can you still have false positives with? Well,
You can.
I think you mentioned that you did in this case.
Yeah, you can still have false positives with the Kastle-Meyer. So it's just a presumptive test that gives you an indication. Let's look further at this.
So, Detective, I want to switch gears. I want to discuss processing of a portion of a ceiling. Are you familiar with what I'm referring to?
I am,
And can you just generally tell the jurors what your involvement was with that?
certainly. So I was aware in my conversations with the team that a large section of ceiling had been gathered. I was also aware that that piece of evidence had been sent up to the state lab for processing. They processed it for different items and did not come back with enough evidence to support there being DNA on the item. I was told by members of the team that they sent a couple of these pieces of the ceiling down to the private lab we mentioned earlier, DNA labs in Florida, to have tested, and they came back as testing positive for blood.
And
Sustained.
I'll redirect, Judge. So I don't want you to get into the specific testing of any of the items, but just what you did. You explained that.
Okay.
Your Honor, if I may approach.
Yes.
I'm showing the defense what's been marked by identification states exhibit 40 through 51. Detective, I'm handing you what's been marked for identification of states exhibits 40 through 51. And I'm just going to ask that you review each in turn and then look up when you're ready.
Okay.
And Detective, you looked up. So are you familiar with those images as well as what's depicted therein?
I am.
And how are you familiar with them?
I took the photos.
Are they fair and accurate?
They are.
And again, you took these photos?
Yes.
Are they consistent with what you saw the day you took them?
Yes, they are.
All right, this one, I move to strike what's been marked for identification as States Exhibit 40 through 51.
Without objection. Without.
Without objection, the ID is stricken. They're entered as full exhibits. They may be published to the jury.
Thank you. I'm going to take them back. I'm going to put some up on the screen. We'll go through them. So you mentioned being tasked with processing this item. Are you familiar with the item number associated with it?
MER 3D,
And when did your processing occur?
July 15th, 2022.
Specifically, what was the item that you were tasked with processing?
The MER 3D was a large section of ceiling tile, which was sheetrock with some metal strips on the top of it.
And so those images that I asked you to look at, I've put one up on the screen behind you. Can you explain to the jurors what they're looking at?
Yeah, this is the whole piece of evidence as I examined it that day. And you're essentially looking at a center opening that I believe is where a vent was, but I wasn't present when they removed this item. And the metal pieces you see are the strips on the top part of the ceiling. You wouldn't see this from underneath it, but that's what the sheetrock would have been mounted up to.
And when you say you weren't present for the removal, is that from the location that it was taken from?
Correct.
The shelter, the fit shelter?
Correct.
And so what does this image depict?
This image is evidence. I requested that the item be, that I examine the item because we didn't, well, I won't speak to the lab results, but I requested that I review the item to see if I could find any potential traces of evidence that we should be looking for. So the evidence technicians brought this out for a viewing. I viewed the item. I noticed things on the item that made me suspicious that there were additional areas that we should be testing.
Detective Lamy, let me ask you this. When you received the item from the laboratory, was it packaged up?
Yes, so it was, this is how I found it at evidence. The evidence technicians brought it out, they opened it, and this is how I found it.
Your Honor, may I approach?
Yes.
So Detective Lamy, I'm showing you it's been marked for identification as States Exhibit 108. Are you familiar with this item?
I am.
And what is it?
It's a hand sketch that I made of the ceiling.
And when we discussed your processing of that portion of the ceiling, how did you process it?
So the entire physical piece, as you see it here, was brought into our training room at the police station. It was placed on 2 work tables with that side face up. It was removed from the evidence bag that it was in and placed on butcher block paper on the tables. Then we went through the process of basically dismantling the metal pieces from the sheetrock.
And let me stop you there.
Mhm.
Going through that process of dismantling the metal framing from the sheetrock, was it important to keep track of what was coming from where on this object as a whole?
Yes, so because the whole piece was entered into evidence as one evidence number, once I was going to start dismantling it, I attached my own initials and numbers to each piece that was then separated.
So when you attached your own initials, did you still preserve the earlier initials? So MER 3D and then your initials following that?
Correct.
And so this item that I've just shown you, why did you create this?
Well, other than having photos of it, this helps to show where the positioning of each of the items was. It's not to scale, but it shows where the items were so that we could have a better understanding.
Did you create this as demonstrative to show where each piece came from?
Yes,
Each of the pieces, I think you mentioned this, but you gave a specific evidence number of its own with your own initials attached.
correct.
Is this a fair and accurate representation of the sketch that you created?
Yes.
Or at this point, I move to strike the ID of States Exhibit 108. That is full and published to the jury.
No objection.
The ID is stricken. It's entered as a full exhibit. It may be published.
And so I've added the image to the screen behind you. That states Exhibit 108. And I want to discuss the items that you packaged or that you removed. You mentioned the railing. Did you remove any other items?
We separated several of the pieces of the sheetrock from the main unit. There was one large piece that I ended up keeping intact, but then we separated off parts that didn't appear to be important as far as any potential evidence items on it.
And you mentioned taking the photos. Did you give those photos specific evidence numbers?
Yes,
Did you provide a description along with each of those evidence numbers?
I did.
And so can you explain to the jury what they're looking at here?
So and I'll point up here if you can't see, let me know, but I just put a tape measure on it just to see what the distance was between the metal grids. On here, there's also a couple of handwritten letters written right onto the sheetrock. That was not done by me. I presume that was done by the state lab. And there's what appears to be a dark stain in the center of this piece of sheetrock.
And so the letters that you're referring to, if you can just read them for the jurors.
Far left is the letter A next to that cutout. B, cutout. C and D are in the stain area.
And when you received this item back from the state crime lab, or the state forensic laboratory rather, that had already been done. That's not something that you did during your processing.
That's correct.
So this item is MER 3D RL4. Can you describe what the jurors are seeing in this picture?
RL4 is the metal grid that runs across here. It was sitting on top of that dark stain, and it's lifted up on edge, so it flipped up on its side. And there's also dark staining on the metal itself.
And when you say the dark staining, did that become an area of potential evidentiary value during your processing?
Yes, it did.
And I just want to show the jurors where that item, MER 3D RL4, came from. Do you see it depicted on the sketch you drew?
So RL4 is the section that runs completely across the larger piece. And in this smaller box, it's right here.
And what's depicted in this image?
This is still part of MER 3D RL4. It's the other end of the piece, and it's also showing dark staining running underneath that grid.
I want to move on to RL14. What's depicted in this image?
RL14 ended up being a piece of the sheetrock that we separated from the main piece. It separated approximately at where this line is, and this is the dark stain on the sheetrock itself that had been under RL4.
And I want to look at where that came from in relation to the portion of the ceiling that you processed. Can you just point that out on your sketch?
So RL14 is this section right about to here, over to about this line that extends from here.
And what does this image depict?
RL16, so this line right here would have been where RL4, that long strip that runs across, and then RL16 is another section of sheetrock that we separated from the main piece of interest, and approximately at where that thin line is going across, that's where we separated that piece from.
During your processing of MER 3D, did you become aware of low points or warps essentially in the drywall and framing area?
I can't tell by looking at it the way it's laying on our workstations if the item would have been angled when it was sitting on the ceiling itself. But what I can tell from looking at this, where there was a dark stain in that center, and then you see a much darker stain running along that railing, it would appear that the fluid that would have made that stain would have run along that, which is not uncommon for fluid to track an object that's attached to it.
Did the fluid, the staining, appear to be absorbed into the drywall?
It appeared to be absorbed into the drywall more in that center area where it was a lighter color. And then it was much heavier consistency along where the rail had been.
And what is depicted in this item, this image?
So this is still part of where RL4 was, sitting on top of it. And this is just a shot from the side of the piece to show that there's depth to the staining itself.
At the time of your processing, Detective Lemmy, were you aware of other testing that had been conducted on this item at the lab?
I was.
Laboratory. And can you tell the jurors what that is?
So those two square cutouts that you saw on the sheetrock itself where the paper was missing, those two had been cut out and sent down to the lab as part of the state's processing of the item. And the results came back.
Objection, you're saying?
Sustained.
Not asking you for the results, but you were aware of other testing that had been conducted.
Correct.
Were you aware of fingerprint testing, latent print testing conducted on the item?
I hadn't reviewed results of that, but I was aware that some had been attempted.
What does this image depict?
It's just another more direct on from the side of where RL4 had been sitting, or the kind of the thick layer of staining.
And again, this item.
Again, this is RL4 going across, and then this section that goes up, that's where RL3 railing had been.
In this image.
And this just continues on. This is where RL3 was. RL2 was down in this area. That's where the initial stain had been, and then RL1 would have been up in this area.
Are you aware of whether there was a vent involved in the processing of this item?
I was aware just from the team, but I had not viewed it.
Are you aware of where the opening to that vent would have been?
Yes, the opening of the vent would have been in this area. There was metal grids coming out this way in the initial photos.
You mentioned the Kastle-Meyer testing. Did you swab? Did you test? Did you use the Kastle-Meyer test
I did.
during your processing? And what's depicted in the image?
So again, this is the part of RL4 that we were looking at predominantly. It's showing my sample swab, and it's showing a bright pink result. So essentially, the swab was used, it was dipped into sterile water, it was rubbed on the staining itself in that area, and then the Kastle-Meyer test was applied to it. And once the the couple of drops of the hydrogen peroxide were applied to it, it was an immediate pink.
And can you remind the jurors what that immediate pink, what it told you?
The faster it reacts, the more likelihood it is that it's a positive versus a false positive.
Detective Lemmy, based on your processing of MER 3D overall, the portion of the ceiling that you processed, did you submit any of those items to DNA Labs International?
I did.
And what of those items did you submit?
That whole piece of sheetrock that remained after those other few that we looked at were removed was sent down as one item. The rails that came off, RL1, RL2, RL3, and RL4, those were packaged separately and sent down as well.
And let's talk about those rails, Detective Lemmy. When you removed the rails from the drywall, did you have any observations?
So other than the darker staining like this that was present under a couple of them, once RL4, which was the long piece, and over the part that was more heavily stained, as soon as that piece came up off the sheetrock, there was a noticeable foul smell.
And what was that smell associated with?
I would speculate that it's from that stain itself.
Detective Lemmy, I want to switch gears and I want to talk about the ceiling itself. We have portions of it here, and I'm going to ask that you remove, and you have your evidence custodian with you, technician with you. I'm going to ask that you remove them from their packaging to show to the jury. And so, Your Honor, I would just ask that this witness be permitted to move freely with the evidence technician.
Yes, you may. Go ahead.
So, Detective Lemmy, I'm just going to ask that you remove certain items, and then I'd like you to identify where that specific item would be in relation to the scale that
You want us to maintain individual drugs for each item, or you know?
Yes, please. And Detective Lemmy, if you can start with Exhibit 74, identified as MER 3D RL13. Lenny will be assisting you. Specifically with respect to RL13, is that one of the items that was sent down to DNA Labs International in Florida?
Yes, it was.
Council, while they're doing that, could you approach the studio?
Ask that you pick it up. Sorry to ask, but pick it up and just show it to the jurors if you can. Walk in front.
Yeah, actually, if you pick it up, I don't think it is.
Right. And Detective Lemmy, you can set that down. Your Honor, I would move to mark what's been marked for identification as State's Exhibit 74 as full strike ID and publish. I missed doing that prior. There's no objection.
No objection.
All right, the ID is stricken. It's entered as a full exhibit.
So, Detective Lemmy, you can just identify where RL13 is in relation to the sketch that you've drawn. Sure.
And for the jurors, if it's difficult to see because it's low to the ground and you want to stand, you should feel free to do that, okay?
As it was presented to you from that face view, what you saw was the cutoff from here over this way down to about this section. And that's what that bottom dark stain was from here over to the edge.
I would just ask if Your Honor would allow, if the second time, you can just point that out to the jurors.
He can point it out, yes,
At least you approach closer to the jurors.
on the board?
With the board.
Oh, sure, yeah. Just the condition of that, I didn't think it made sense to get too close.
So what you were seeing down behind the paper was the dark stain emanating this way. RL3 had been here, you saw a small jet out of dark stain, and the darker is in this section. And RL4 was this piece that ran straight across the loop.
I think we can just move exhibit 74. I want to move on to exhibit 75, which is RL 15.
original packaging that the whole piece would come in.
So if it's the wrong number, that's fine. We can move on. Can we go to what's been marked for identification as Exhibit 76? That's RL 15.
So just to be clear, that item was the original packaging that MEI 3D was in.
So the pusher paper that we saw in the exhibit, that's what it was set on.
Yeah, the first photo that showed it sitting on the table, partially open. All of that paper is what.
Was that also submitted to the lab in Florida?
No.
That's 875.
It is. And Detective Lammy, while you're opening that, can you just describe for the jurors what this item is, RL 15?
So this one is RL 15. The way I showed it to you earlier. RL 4 went all the way back to this. RL 15 is just to cut that out. So this piece was not submitted to me.
And if you could just hold it up for the jurors to see. Your Honor, I would move to strike ID and mark as full, States Exhibit 76.
Without objection.
Right, the ID is stricken. It's entered as a full exhibit.
Detective Lammy, I'd like to move on to what's been marked for identification as States Exhibit 77. That's RL 16.
While they're working on that, counsel, do you want to approach?
And Detective Lammy, if you can just describe what this item is and where it came from, according to your sketch.
So RL 16, I'll keep it consistent as far as I was holding it for you. That item is running from here out to the end, approximately down this way over. And RL1 railing has nothing touching that particular piece because RL 16 is this area right here.
And on your sketch, where is the vent area located?
That's down here.
So this would have been a void, essentially.
Yes.
Let's move to the next item. I'd ask that exhibit be marked full, ID stricken, and published to the jury.
The ID is stricken. It's entered as a full exhibit. It can be published to the jury.
Detective Lemmy, I want to move to States Exhibit 78, what's been identified as RL 11. Your Honor, the same with that item. I'd ask that States Exhibit, what's been identified, marked for identification as States Exhibit 79, that the ID be stricken, it be marked as full and published.
Without objection.
Sorry, you said 79.
I'm sorry, 78,
Okay, 78.
RL 11.
The ID is stricken, it's entered as a full exhibit, and it can be published to the jury when it's taken out.
And while that's being opened up, Detective Lenny, can you just tell the jurors what this item is and where its relative location was on that portion of the ceiling according to your scale?
So in same place, the division, opening where the loaded one, the RO loaded.
Was this item submitted to the laboratory? No. It wasn't. Thank you, Detective. And if we can move to what's been marked for identification as State's Exhibit 79, that's MER 3D. State's Exhibit 79. State's Exhibit 80 for identification. And 80 is RL3 3A.
So 79 remains for identification, is that accurate? So I have 75, 75, and 79 remaining for ID, correct?
Correct.
That's your understanding, Attorney Brown?
Judge. And while that's being open, Detective Lemmy, if you can just describe where that item was collected from in relation to the sketch of the portion of that ceiling.
RO 3 is the middle of it. RO 4.
Again, Your Honor, I move to strike ID, mark as full and publish.
Objection?
No objection.
The ID is stricken on Exhibit 80. It's entered as a full exhibit and it can be published to the jury.
This is the metal rail. This is how the orientation would have been according to holding up to that chart. Running down, RL4 was running across this way.
And Detective Lemmy, if you can just show them the underside of that rail.
This is the side closest to RL4 that was running across.
And was this item submitted to the lab in Florida?
Yes, it was.
And Detective Lemmy, when you're ready, I'd like to move on to State's Exhibit 81, what's been marked as State's Exhibit 81 for identification. That's RL3, RL4, RL12. Your Honor, I move to strike ID and mark as full State's Exhibit 81 and publish it.
No objection.
The ID is stricken. It is entered as a full exhibit. It may be published to the jury once it is open.
Detective Lemmy, while that's being opened, can you please describe for the jurors where this piece of evidence came from in relation to that portion of the ceiling using the sketch that you found?
This was actually.
I'm sorry, he needs a microphone, please.
So RL4 and RL12 were attached. We did not separate them when we processed this because we didn't want to cause any damage to what would have been underneath it. RL12 is this part that runs across the opening. RL4 runs all the way across.
You mentioned a smell and you removed rails. Is this the rail that we're referring to?
Correct.
Sorry, I wasn't near a mic. You mentioned a smell when you removed those rails. Was that the rail you were referring to?
Yes, it was. This would be the orientation as we found it. This would have been the grade opening in RL4, and then the other pieces that were attached to it.
When you say grill, and that's the void.
Yes,
Detective Lemmy, was this item also sent to the laboratory for?
yes, it was.
Detective Lemmy, thank you. Are there any questions for the defense?
Go ahead, finish, I'll get him back on the stand. And sir, when you're ready, if you would just retake the stand for cross-examination.
Good afternoon, Detective.
Good afternoon, sir.
My name is Jamie Brooks. I don't believe we've met, but I represent Adam Montgomery. I also have a few questions for you. I want to go back, though, to what was addressed during the beginning of your direct examination. That's the blue Audi.
Mhm.
You were involved in the processing of that?
Yes, I was.
And you mentioned earlier that there was evidence that was collected from the Audi.
Correct.
And that evidence was also submitted to the lab.
Some of it.
Let's talk about that, some of it. And again, how does a piece of evidence get labeled?
We typically have one of the detectives use their own initials, and then we'll start at, if it's the beginning of the project and they haven't labeled anything yet, usually starts around 1 and then works its way up from there.
And when it came to the collection of evidence from the Audi, there were a fair number of JPs, correct?
Yes,
JP standing for?
James Pittman.
And a number of those pieces of evidence collected by Pittman, you decided to have submitted to the lab?
Yes.
And could you please tell the jury what particular items you had submitted to the lab?
If I could review my report.
You most certainly may. Actually, if I were to, are you familiar with something called a crime scene note?
Yes.
And what is a crime scene note?
Well, a crime scene note is typically an overall write-up of the processing of a scene.
I am going to, may I approach, Your Honor?
Yes, you may.
I'm handing you what has been marked 2457 basement. Do you recognize that document?
This was not created by myself.
Not created by yourself, but it was a crime scene note from the collection of the Audi.
Yes.
And does that include a list, an exhaustive list of the items collected from the car?
It should.
Would reviewing that help you recall which items you had submitted to the lab?
Probably not, because this wouldn't pertain any of the processing that was done after the collection. There would be a lab submittal that I probably created, And that would list the items that I sent up?
And that lab submittal would assist you.
Yes.
Judge, I think this would be a good time for a break.
Approach.
I am now handing you what has been marked. It has not been marked, but for bait stamps purposes, it's 3026. Do you recognize this document?
Yes, sir.
Would looking at it for a minute or two help refresh your recollection?
Only in terms of the actual evidence item numbers, what the physical piece is, I can't tell from here without
Okay.
looking at photos or additional documentation.
So, well, let's stick with the numbers then.
Okay.
Having reviewed that report, what items did you have submitted to the lab for potential testing?
119, and these are all JP. 153, 195, 224, 251, 216, 225.
So I understand that you may not be able to recognize, for example, specifically what 119 was or 195, but those samples, the JPs collected from the Audi, did some of those include specimens from the floor mat?
The carpeted floor mat that I tested initially with the hemosticks,
Yes.
those were different numbers. Those were JP 120 and 122.
And those were submitted to the lab as well,
Yes,
correct?
sir. Yeah.
Do you recall a cash register receipt?
I do.
Could that have been one of the items submitted to the lab for analysis?
I believe so.
A shoebox?
Yes.
Blue bath towel?
I would have to jog my memory about the bath towel.
Detective, do you still have up there the casing note?
Yes. And sir, what was the evidence item number for the bath towel?
153.
Would you like me to read the listing as far as how Detective Heil listed it?
Just wanted to confirm that a blue bath towel was sent to the submitted for analysis.
So he identified it as towel with unidentified stains. He did not list the color.
Cash register receipt. Do you recall having that submitted?
I do.
A pink sweater, women's?
Yes, sir.
A folder with papers?
Number on that one, sir?
Take a look at 224 and see if that refreshes your recollection.
Yes, sir.
And what is your recollection now?
That was paperwork that was submitted.
A gray bath towel? Does that ring a bell?
Number?
225. See if that refreshes your recollection.
Yes. Towel with unknown stains. He did not reference the color. My photos would show it, though.
I apologize. I didn't hear that last response.
The photos that I took during the processing would also help if you wanted me to clarify the color.
Fair to say, though, that 2 bath towels were submitted for analysis.
Yes, sir.
Finally, do you recall a length of twine?
Yes, sir.
And again, that was collected and submitted to the lab?
Correct.
I now want to turn to your use of bloodstain reagents, latent bloodstain reagents. In the processing of the Audi, you used hemosticks,
Yes, sir.
Kastelmeyer.
Yes, sir.
You were also involved in the processing of a Chrysler Sebring.
I was involved in that as an assistant to the detective that was processing it.
Detective O'Leary.
Yes, sir.
And when you were there assisting him in the processing of that Sebring, does January 7th of 2022 sound correct?
I would be guessing.
Okay. But he was using Blue Star.
Yes, sir. I remember that.
And that, again, is another latent bloodstain reagent.
It is.
And whenever, regardless of which type of agent was being used, whenever there was a presumptive positive, it was collected.
I can't speak to the Sebring because I didn't process that vehicle. I can only speak to the Audi.
Okay. So when it came to the Sebring, were you there for the Blue Star part of the processing of that vehicle on the 7th, or no?
I was there when he blue starred the trunk area.
But it's your understanding that the practice, your practice, the practice of the Manchester Police Department is that when there is a presumptive positive, it is something that's preserved.
If we did a swab of an area, we would typically preserve it.
And that's what you did in the processing of the Audi, correct?
Yes, sir.
I believe, as you said on direct, that you preserved the ability to be able to look further at an item if there was a presumptive positive.
Yes, sir.
And again, you want to over collect as opposed to under collect.
I do.
I don't have anything further. Thank you, Detective.
You're welcome, sir.
Anything further?
Just briefly. Detective Lemmy, I just want to follow up with the items that you were asked about on cross-examination by Attorney Brooks. All of those items that you just identified, I think we talked about them on direct as well. Were they from the blue Audi that you processed?
The particular numbers that we reviewed, I believe, were from the Audi.
Was that the same Audi that was covered in mold?
Yes, sir.
And Detective Lemmy, let me ask you this. Do you know where that car was in 2020?
I do not.
How about 2021?
I do not.
How about 2022?
I know it was in the evidence processing bay at Manchester Police.
At some point?
Yeah.
Do you know who that vehicle belonged to?
I know that there was consent forms provided, I believe, by 2 different people. One of them was Donna Demers. I'd have to review my notes to see the other one.
And does Anthony Badero stand out to you, that name?
It doesn't.
Okay. Same questions with the Chrysler Sebring. Do you know where that vehicle was in 2020?
I do not.
2021?
No.
2022?
It had been in the evidence processing bay at Manchester Police.
Thank you, Detective Lemmy.
No recross.
You may step down.
Thank you, ma'am.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, it's just about 12:15, so a good time for our lunch break. I remind you, don't discuss the case with anybody. Don't watch any social media. Don't do any independent research. We'll come back in an hour, so please be back at 1:15. All right, 1:15, everybody. Thank you so much. rewrap, or what do you need to do processing wise?
I would ask that Mr. Fido be able to repackage items.
Okay, one minute. All right, they can do it now. I just asked them to do it expeditiously so the court staff can have a break as well. Okay, very good. Thank you.
Dave, right now, he's done. Sorry, right now. Jamie, any objection? Just watch your step.
If you could remain standing and just raise your right hand. You swear that the testimony that you'll provide this jury will be the truth and nothing but the truth under the pains and penalties of perjury.
I do.
You can have a seat, Ms. Redwood, and make yourself comfortable. And when you're ready, if you could just start by stating and spelling your full name for the record.
My name is Rachel Radwich. First is Rachel, last Radwich.
Ms. Radwich, how are you presently employed? What do you do for a living?
I work for the Manchester Police Department in the Evidence Division.
And how long have you worked with the Manchester Police Department?
It'll be 9 years this September.
In those 9 years, have you held more than one position with the Manchester Police Department?
I have. So I started off as a emergency communications dispatcher. And then after about 2 or 3 years, I began working in evidence as an evidence specialist. And then as of last July, I was promoted to the evidence supervisor.
And what are your current duties and responsibilities as an evidence supervisor?
So I primarily oversee the 3 evidence specialists that also work in my unit. I oversee the intake and collection of all evidence that comes into the evidence division, as well as maintain control of all of our storage rooms, ensure that all policies and procedures are being followed, and just keeping up with day-to-day tasks, completing requests, that sort of thing.
You mentioned the intake of all evidence. And can you just walk the jurors through that process, how things are taken in by the Manchester Police Department?
So generally speaking, either a patrol officer or a detective from the investigative division is the one collecting items from the scene or whatever they're working. All of our lockers or storage units for temporary storage have a one-way locking mechanism. So essentially the officer puts the item in. Once they lock it and secure it, only someone from evidence can access that item. From there, we maintain that the packaging used was the proper packaging to maintain integrity of that item. And then we decide on proper storage for long-term purposes for that, update the computer, make sure everything kind of checks out, and then put it away until it's needed for further analysis.
Ms. Radwich, you just mentioned that the detectives will collect things. Are you in a position where you go out and collect items?
So on large-scale scenes, my unit will be asked to assist, to include myself.
And you've mentioned evidence rooms, lockers, and storage units. Can you just describe those for the jurors so they're familiar? Are those all at the Manchester Police Department here in town?
Yeah, so primarily most of our rooms are at Manchester Police Department. We have about 12 rooms on the second floor, all under the control of the evidence unit. It's limited access in, and then only the 4 of us in evidence can actually get into those rooms. We also have some outside storage areas for things that can't be brought in, so like explosives, bicycles. And then we have a room that's for ventilation. We call it our vented storage, so anything that isn't a drug item, which requires double security within the building, but still needs some sort of airflow due to the smell, that'll get stored in our vented storage. That way you're not bringing in something that stinks into the building to then permeate my office.
So, Ms. Radwich, I want to back up for just a second. To be an evidence supervisor, does that require any specific training or education?
So it requires experience in the evidence unit. I hold my Bachelor of Science degree in Forensic Science, as well as a Master's of Science degree in Criminal Justice. I've had training and certification through the International Association of Property and Evidence. And then there's also just on-the-job training that you get exposed to just through years of working in that division.
Did you do continuing, or have you done continuing training during your 9 years with the Manchester Police Department?
So I mostly stay up to date with case law, so local, state, and federal laws, make sure we're adhering to that. Stay up to date with our CALIA standards, which is accreditation for the police department, make policy changes as necessary to reflect that. And then I keep up with, technological advances. We work closely with the New Hampshire State Forensic Lab as far as different analysis that they're doing, keeping up with that Association for Property and Evidence, as well as we work closely with the FBI and the ATF, and kind of always maintaining a constant communication of where we need to be at to secure and maintain evidence.
Now, Ms. Radwich, I'd like to switch gears, and I want to talk about the case of a missing child, Harmony Montgomery. What was your role, just generally, your role and involvement on the case of the missing child, Harmony Montgomery?
So for this case, I was still an evidence specialist, so I hadn't been yet promoted. And I had a few different roles within this, but primarily it was to assist the detective division for those large scale scenes, just to help maintain and document any evidence that's being brought in, ensure the integrity and packaging of those items.
Do you recall when your involvement on this matter began?
I want to say it was January 2022, and at that point, it would have just been primarily the intaking and storing of items coming in. At that point, it wasn't a full-scale investigation to what it ended up being. So just, different interview discs, paperwork, that sort of thing, we were collecting through those one-way lockers and putting them into storage.
And you mentioned earlier that you're in charge of intake of all evidence that's brought into the Manchester Police Department. Are you aware of whether or not evidence has been brought to the Manchester Police Department regarding this case?
Yes, there has been a lot of evidence.
When you say a lot, what does that mean?
About 900 pieces, give or take.
Ms. Radwich, during your involvement in this case, did you ship items from the Manchester Police Department to DNA Labs International?
Yes, so we would take items being stored at Manchester Police Evidence Office, and I would transport it to a FedEx facility. Generally, we go to the one in Bedford and do standard express overnight delivery of those items directly to DNA Labs International in Florida.
And I want to discuss specifically an evidence item bearing the evidence item number MER 3D-RL1 through RL18. Are you familiar with those items?
Vaguely. I know MER 3D is the ceiling tile, and then anything with the RL attached would be any of the rails or screws that were removed from that ceiling tile.
And can you just describe to the jury how you became familiar with the ceiling portion, the rails that you just mentioned?
Okay, so MER 3D is a large piece of drywalled ceiling tile. There's a vent opening with metal rails. I first became familiar with it when, of course, it came into my office and we needed to store it. I was also part of transporting that item to and from the lab being the state forensic lab. Once that came back to my office, after testing was done at the state level, I was then overseeing that piece of evidence being reopened essentially, so that the analysts could get smaller cuttings for a deeper analysis, only because transporting that ceiling tile was just becoming too much. It's very large, required 2 people. So it was decided that cuttings would be taken for further processing instead of transferring this massive piece back and forth.
And let me stop you there. You said that the analyst made the cuttings.
Yes.
Were you there when the analyst made the cuttings?
Yes.
And what was that analyst's name?
Kevin McMahon.
And that's an individual from the lab
Yes.
here in New Hampshire. Do you know whether he made specific markings on the areas that he cut?
There were markings made next to the squares that were cut out.
Following that interaction, did you have occasion to see that item again in your facility here at the Manchester Police Department?
Yes. So shortly after that time frame, that was mid to late June. And then about a month or so later, we again had to pull the ceiling tile out, and we brought it to our second floor training room, essentially to remove the metal rails from the piece of drywall. The reasoning for this is, again, it was really big, really bulky, and we wanted to see what was under those rails. So I was amongst a team of detectives. We took the ceiling tile that was stored securely in the evidence division. We wheeled it down in its packaging to the training room, which was right down the hall from my office. And then once there, we did what we needed to do to get those rails removed.
Do you recall with any specificity the detectives that you mentioned?
It was Sergeant Lovejoy, Detective Lammy, Detective Bombard, and Detective Rayhill.
That's Max Rayhill.
Yes.
And so did you unpackage the item that day? You mentioned it was in July. Do you recall the specific day?
I want to say it was the 18th.
So on July 18th, did you unpackage the item for the detectives?
Yes. So once we got to the training room, we put down a clean piece of craft paper, put this item on top of it, and then just carefully open it up so as to not disturb the contents underneath. Of course, we had to use a knife to cut into it because it was wrapped in cardboard, given that it was drywall, so we didn't want it to bend and then break.
Did you have any impressions when the rails came off that item with MER 3D?
Yeah, so first looking at the ceiling tile, you could see some like dark staining on the drywall backing. And then as the rails were being removed, you could see dark red, like crusted staining along the rails as well as slightly underneath. And as the rails were being removed by the detectives, I could smell just a foul odor coming from that piece of drywall as the rail was being lifted.
And were you familiar with that foul odor that you smelled?
Yes.
And can you explain that to the jurors? How are you familiar with it, with the smell?
So the smell, I would call it like a pungent rotting smell. And I'm familiar with that, and I would associate that with decomposition. I know what that smell is like. I've worked on numerous crime scenes in which there was a body present. I've attended an autopsy, and I've also regularly handled evidence that comes in from death scenes.
At the Manchester Police Department, do you have a specific location for such items with body fluids decomposition?
So yes, that would be the ventilated storage, but given the importance of this piece of evidence and the amount of packaging that was wrapped around it, again, there was layers of cardboard. It was really maintained and sturdy. We kept that in our upstairs evidence room. That way it would be better preserved and the integrity would maintain through different weather changes, that sort of thing.
If I can have a moment. Thank you. No further questions.
No questions.
Let me sit down.
Thank you.
Sometimes we have to take witnesses, not necessarily order that we would like. We'd like to call a particular witness. Mr. Montgomery to the stand, please take advantage of the translation services that are available to us today.
All right. The witness is coming, and then I'll ask the interpreter to please step up as well.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Yes, thank you. That would be great.
And sir,
And the interpreter has been placed under oath
La intérprete
to interpret to the best of her skill, knowledge, and ability.
A la intérprete se le ha puesto bajo juramento para que interprete a lo mejor de sus habilidades.
good afternoon, Mr. Mondrag.
Buenas tardes, señor Mondrag.
If you could please stand up for a moment,
Sí, por favor, se podría poner de pie.
and if you would please raise your right
Se puede
hand.
alzar la mano derecha.
Do you solemnly swear
Usted jura solemnemente
testimony you give this jury
que el testimonio que usted va a dar ante este jurado
will be the truth,
va a ser la
the
verdad,
whole truth,
la verdad completa
and nothing but the
y
truth?
solo la verdad,
So help you God.
bajo la ayuda de Dios?
Sí.
Yes.
Thank you, sir. Please feel free to have a seat.
Puede tomar asiento.
Mr. Mondrag, as we're being recorded here today,
Señor Mondrag, ahora nos están grabando,
will you please state your name and spell both your first and your last name?
por favor, nos podría decir su nombre y también deletrear su primer nombre y su apellido.
Jared Brian Luján Mondragón.
Jared Brian Lungano Mondragón.
Y-A-R-E-D.
de
YARD.
And your last name, sir. Would you
Y
spell your last name,
Lujano,
please?
Lujano.
Lugano, LUJANO.
And is that your full name, sir?
¿Y eso es su nombre completo, señor? Yes.
Sir, what town do you live in?
Señor, ¿en qué pueblo vive usted?
En Manchester,
En Manchester.
And how long have you lived in
¿Y
Manchester?
cuánto tiempo ha vivido usted en Manchester?
23 años.
23 years.
23 years. Okay.
23 años, ok.
What do you do for work, sir?
¿En qué trabaja usted?
En drywall y metal frame,
En drywall and metal frame.
How long have you done that kind of work?
¿En cuánto tiempo ha hecho usted ese tipo de trabajo?
15 años.
About 15 years.
Years. If I could approach the witness, please, Your Honor.
Si me puedo acercar al testigo, por favor.
To show you Mark States Exhibit 30.
Señor Lugano Mondragon, estoy aquí para mostrarle lo que se llama la prueba número 30.
Do you recognize this building?
¿Usted reconoce este edificio?
Sí.
Yes.
Have you ever done work at this building?
¿Usted alguna vez ha trabajado en este edificio? Yes.
What kind of work did you do there?
¿Qué tipo de trabajo hizo usted allí?
y rocky frame.
Sheetrocking and framing.
Do you know or have you ever met someone by the name of Adam Montgomery?
¿Usted conoce o alguna vez ha conocido una persona con el nombre de Adam Montgomery?
No.
No.
And do you know or have you met with anyone by the name of Caleb Montgomery?
¿Y usted conoce o ha conocido a alguna persona con el nombre de Caleb Montgomery?
No.
No.
And that location where you did work installing sheetrock,
¿Y ese lugar donde usted hizo trabajo instalando el sheetrock,
did you ever live at that address?
usted alguna vez vivió en esa dirección? No.
And other than doing the work for the sheetrock, have you ever been back to that address?
Fuera de hacer ese trabajo con el sheetrock, ¿y usted ha regresado a esa dirección? No.
Thank you, sir. I don't have any other questions for you. Defense counsel may
Gracias.
have
No
a few.
tengo otra pregunta para usted, la defensa.
And I have no question.
Y yo no tengo preguntas, su señoría.
Your Honor, we'd ask the witness to please be excused then.
A su señoría pediríamos que excusen al testigo.
You are excused, sir.
Está escuchado. Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Gracias.
Yes, thank you.
And Your Honor, at this time, the state calls criminalist Kevin McMahon to the stand.
Just be careful of the wires, please, sir.
And Mr. McMahon, if you would please remain standing for a moment and please raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you give this jury will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help you God.
I do.
Thank you, sir. Please feel free to have a seat.
Good afternoon, Your Honor.
Yeah.
Good afternoon.
And Mr. McMahon, there's some water up there for you if you need it, or if you need a break at any time, please let us know, okay?
Thank you.
Would you please, because we're being recorded here today, state your full name, spelling both your first and your last name for the record?
My name is Kevin, Kevin, middle initial G, and my last name is McMahon, capital MC, capital MAHON.
And Mr. McMahon, up until last year, where did you work?
I was formerly employed by the New Hampshire State Police Forensic Laboratory in Concord, New Hampshire,
How long did you work for them?
for over 40 years.
And it's my understanding that you retired last year from there.
Yes, I did.
What was your position while you were working at the lab?
I was assigned to the Forensic Biology Unit,
And was there an official title that you had?
Criminalist 2.
And what does that mean to be a criminalist 2 at the New Hampshire State Police Forensic Lab?
Well, a Criminalist 1 is an entry-level position. Criminalist 2 would be more of a journeyman level position, where you have more responsibilities or more duties assigned to you than a Criminalist 1 would.
I understand that you said that you were there for 40 years. What were the different units of the lab that you worked in during those 40 years?
I worked primarily in the Forensic Biology Unit, although way back when it was just Forensic Serology. I was actually hired as a drug chemist, but then was transferred into the serology section. But over the years, I took on additional responsibilities, most of those dealing with the analysis of items of what are known as trace evidence, which would include the examination of hairs and fibers, the examination of paints and plastics, and the examination of automobile lamps, specifically the filaments in a lamp for purposes of determining whether a taillight or a headlight was on or off at the time of a collision.
And Mr. McMahon, let me ask you, can you go through a little bit of what your educational background was, specifically in the area of dealing with serology and the identification of bodily fluids?
Well, I hold both Bachelor of Science and Master of Science degrees in forensic science from the University of New Haven in West Haven, Connecticut. And both those programs were overseen by fairly well-known forensic biochemists at the time. And so it would be difficult for someone to go through that program without having a lot of experience and exposure to forensic serology. And so in addition to what I learned about forensic serology while undergoing my education, I underwent extensive on-the-job training soon after transferring to the serology section of the lab back in 1983.
And could you please explain what forensic serology is? What is that the science of?
So forensic serology is that area of expertise within the field of the forensic sciences that deals specifically with the identification and the characterization of blood and other body fluids as they are associated with physical evidence. And it's the screening process which in modern times immediately precedes DNA testing.
In addition to your educational background, have you received any specialized training after you obtained your degrees within that field of serology?
Well, over the years, I've had a number of opportunities to attend various schools and workshops and symposia dealing with various aspects of forensic science, some of those specifically dealing with forensic serology.
Are you a member of any professional organizations when it comes to serology or to detection?
Well, I'm a member in good standing of the Northeastern Association of Forensic Scientists.
And over your career, how many serological analysis or serology analysis would you estimate that you've made?
Serological analyses, I would estimate in the thousands or tens of thousands.
Have you ever been qualified in court as an expert witness in the subject of serology?
I have many times.
And were those in New Hampshire courts?
Yes.
Okay. And does that include this particular jurisdiction where we are today, Hillsborough County, Northern District?
It does.
Your Honor, at this time, I'd ask the court to please qualify Mr. McMahon as an expert in the field of forensic serology.
Any objection?
I have no objection to him giving his opinion.
The court finds that he is qualified as an expert.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. McMahon, what was your involvement into the investigation into the death of Harmony Montgomery?
I was assigned as the point person, at least as far as any requests that were made by the Manchester Police Department for testing or examination of evidence for biological materials, primarily in this case, blood or hairs.
I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the evidence that you did do serology testing or at least examinations on in this case. It's my understanding that several of the items that you examined had no stain, that you saw nothing to be tested. Is that correct?
That's correct. There were a number of items that I examined and did not find any stains or deposits that I felt were characteristic of blood. And so no further testing was done beyond a mere physical examination.
And then were there other items that you looked at that you did test, but it turned out that they were negative for blood?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Were there also an item or two that you tested that was positive for blood?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So I'd like to start then, understanding that those are three categories of things that you found. I want to start with some of the evidence that you tested that did not have blood on them, things that were examined and tested, but then did not have blood. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
Okay. What pieces of evidence did you test that you found out that they did not have blood on them? And I'd like to start specifically with items that you tested on January 5th of 2022, excuse me, that you wrote in a report on January 5th of 2022. And would you like me to refer to the item names or, excuse me, the numbers that have been assigned to those items? Or do you have a copy of your reports available in case you need to refresh your recollection?
I have a copy of my entire case report. So you can either refer to the date of the report or the exhibit numbers so that I can verify what you're asking me.
And let me ask you, did you sit through a deposition, Mr. McMahon, on the same case?
I did.
And that the same file that you have with you today, is that the one that you had at deposition when you were able to answer Attorney Smith's questions on that day?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Any objection, Attorney Smith, to having him refer to his notes?
No.
Okay. So, Mr. McMahon, let me ask you specifically about a test that you did on an item listed as JMT8. JMT8. And first of all, what was the description that you had for that item?
It was a section of automobile carpeting, not from the passenger compartment, but from the trunk of an automobile.
And let me ask, we're talking about JMT 8. Did you ever meet a detective by the name of Joseph Tucker from the Manchester Police Department?
I'm sorry, what did you ask me?
Did you ever meet a detective by the name of Joseph Tucker from the
I did-
Manchester Police Department?
I did not.
The testing on JMT 8, what were the serological tests that you performed on that, and what was the results?
Well, I performed a physical examination of this piece of carpeting by putting some white paper, some bench paper down on my examination bench, and then taking this section of carpeting out of its original container, laying it out on the bench, and examining it under the normal room lights. And maybe with the assistance of a flashlight, I did not see any staining on there that I thought was suggestive of blood. But knowing that dark colored substrates like this carpeting, which was black, I then employed the use of an infrared light source. It's basically another source of light, but rather than white light that we use for room lighting, it employs infrared light, and the image of what the camera is seeing is projected on a computer tablet. And during the course of this particular examination, I happened to notice a dark colored stain that was not visible under normal room lighting. And I tested that for the presence of blood, and that test was negative.
Did you also test another item with the same initials, JMT5, a T-shirt?
I did.
Okay. And similarly, what were the results on the test on the T-shirt?
In that case, I performed an analysis of a number of stains that were on that T-shirt, and I employed a test that would detect the presence of blood, and each of those tests were negative.
And finally, at one point, did you also, I'm referring to a report that you wrote on June 15th of 2022, or 13th was with a correction on the 15th. Did you ever do an examination of a piece of evidence entitled JD47, an igloo cooler?
I did.
Okay. And what testing did you perform on that piece of evidence?
Again, the testing always begins with a physical examination for deposits which you believe are reflective of or suggestive of blood. There were a number of stains on this particular cooler that seemed to resemble dry blood stains. Each of those was tested chemically in the laboratory by myself, and each of those tests were negative for blood.
With regards to that cooler, could you generally describe what it looked like?
It's a large red igloo portable cooler. It has wheels on it, so it can easily be transported if it's full of ice or other things. And it has a red body. It has a white lid on it and a white liner. And I believe it has like a retractable black metal handle on it, like a wheeled suitcase would.
Yes.
Mr. McMahon, I'm going to put down in front of you State's Exhibit 73. I'm going to lift the lid for a moment and just ask you whether or not you recognize the item that is inside.
Yes, I do.
What do you recognize that item to be?
That is Exhibit JD47, the igloo cooler.
So this is the one that you tested.
Yes, sir.
And could you please just tell us generally, where did you test this item?
If I might refer to my notes.
Yes, please.
So I tested a number of stained areas, 7 different areas.
I'm sorry, did you say 7 different areas?
7 different areas. One stain on the bottom of the base, another stain on the right side of the base of the white top edge, another stain on the red plastic base at the right front corner, another stain at the left side of the base near the white top edge. Let's see, the 5th stain was on the left side of the lid on the edge. 6th was on the right front of the lid at the edge, and the 7th stain was on the right side of the lid at the edge. I drew a diagram to assist me in detecting where on the lid I actually.
And with regards to each one of those tests, were all of those in fact negative for the presence of blood?
Yes, sir.
What was your conclusion with regards to the test on those 7 areas?
Each of the results of each of the tests that I performed on those 7 areas were negative for the presence of blood.
Thank you. In this case, Did Manchester Police Department ever inform you that some of the items had been treated? For example, let's say JMT8, the stain in the trunk. Did they ever tell you that some of these had been treated with a product by the name of Blue Star?
Yes.
And let me ask, does Blue Star interfere with the serological testing that you do?
In and of itself, it does not.
Okay. Does it interfere with the DNA testing of these samples?
It reportedly does not.
What's the testing method that you use when you're testing for the presence of blood?
Well, in the laboratory, I would use a test that's known as the Castle-Mayer test, Kastle-Neyer, Castle-Mayer.
What advantage, if any, does the Castle-Mayer test have over a test like Blue Star?
Well, the benefit of the Castle-Mayer test over a test like Blue Star or some other tests similar to it is that the Castle-Mayer test enjoys a reputation of being both very sensitive and fairly specific. None of these blood detection tests are 100% specific, which means that occasionally they will provide you with a positive result, but it's actually a false positive result. The result that you're getting that you would ordinarily think is positive is in fact a false positive, and it's due to something in the sample that you're testing that you're unaware of.
So with regards to the Castle-Mayer test, is that the test that the New Hampshire State Police Forensic Laboratory uses?
It is.
How long have you been using that test? How familiar are you with that test?
I've been using the Castle-Mayer test since college, and on day one in my introduction into forensic serology testing at the State Police Lab back in 1983.
Does the New Hampshire State Police Forensic Lab use Blue Star?
We do not.
Why not?
We prefer to use a different chemical for trying to find traces of blood at crime scenes. We use a chemical that's known as luminol.
And with regards to the concept of false positives, could you explain what false positives are when it comes to serology testing?
Well, in testing for the presence of blood, the tests that are available to us to detect the presence of blood all rely upon detecting the presence of hemoglobin. In order for a screening test or a detection test to be of any value, it must test for something that's unique in whatever you're looking for. And the one thing that's unique about blood compared to other body fluids is blood has hemoglobin in it, where saliva and semen and other body fluids do not. So all of the blood detection tests rely upon detecting the presence of hemoglobin. And in the Castle-Mayer test, we add a drop of a reagent that's made up of a chemical called phenolphthalein, and we look for a color change at that point. If in fact any of the known or well-recognized false positives are present in your sample, very often you'll see a reaction immediately after adding the phenolphthalein where you shouldn't. It's only after adding the second reagent, hydrogen peroxide, should you see a color change. And in the Castle-Mayer test, we're looking for the formation of a pink color. So if in fact I'm testing something for the presence of blood, and I get that pink color after merely adding the testing reagent,
yeah,
the phenolphthalein. If I get a pink color there, that's a warning to me that the test isn't over yet. It's only halfway through, yet you're getting this pink color, and that would be considered a false positive reaction. It doesn't happen very often, but when it does, you're quite taken back because you're not expecting to see that color so soon. It's only after adding the hydrogen peroxide that you should see the color form, if in fact blood is present. If no color forms, then you can safely conclude that blood is not present.
The hemoglobin that you're trying to detect, what does the first part of that heme, what does heme stand for?
Well, the hemoglobin molecule is fairly large and complex, and a major portion of it contains an iron atom. And that's the heme portion of the hemoglobin molecule, the part that contains the iron.
The part that contains the iron.
That's correct.
Okay. I'd like to now move on to some of the other evidence that you tested, understanding that. Did you test a section of drywall and a T-beam framing in this case that you referred to in your June 13th and then 15th report of 2022?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Specifically, did you test a piece that was entitled MER 3D1, a piece of T-bar framing?
Yes.
Did you also test a piece called MER 3D-3B-1, a swab?
Yes.
And also, did you test any sort of cutting from backing of a piece of drywall?
Yes, I did.
Could you please explain to the jury how you came to examine this exhibit, made that cutting, and then made those tests or conducted those tests?
This large item of evidence was submitted to the laboratory and was opened up by my colleague, criminalist Martin Orlowitz. He was preparing to process this item of evidence for latent fingerprints. But knowing that there was another request for looking for bloodstains, I was called over to conduct that examination prior to his analyses. And after I had examined that item of evidence, I had found several areas that I had suspected that were possibly blood. And so I went about testing several of those areas for the presence of blood using the Castle-Mayer test. And each of the areas that I tested positive for blood.
Before you did that testing, you described before how you would do a physical examination of an item. Did you do that before you decided what areas to test?
Oh, yes.
Okay. And at any point, did you label anything on that piece of drywall, on that backing?
I did. So that it would be clear, if need be down the road, like today, to know exactly where I tested or I took my samples for testing. Every area that I performed a test on a sample from was numbered.
Numbered or lettered?
Well, in the cases of the deposits on the metal frame, they were each given a number. And then on the backside of the drywall portion of the exhibit, there was a very large discoloration, a stain that consisted of light and darker areas. And I elected to test 4 different parts of that one large stain. And that got not only a number, but a number 5, but also a letter, A, B, C, or D.
A, B, C, or D? So it was 4, correct?
That's correct.
All right. And I believe, but if you could please go ahead and I think you may have already said this, what were your conclusions of testing those areas, whether they were positive for the presence of blood?
Each of those areas and everything I tested in that particular exhibit was positive for the presence of blood.
You stated that you were working with somebody else that day at the state lab. Could you say that name again?
Criminalist, that's his title, Martin Orlowitz.
And with regards to criminalist Orlowitz, what unit of the lab does he work in?
He works in the pattern evidence unit.
I'd like to ask some of the samples that you took, or the parts that you were able to cut out and make cuttings. Did you submit those for further DNA analysis inside the lab?
Yes, I swabbed the blood deposits that were on the metal frame because that was the most effective way of removing the blood from that metal surface by transferring it to a swab that had been moistened with something called digest buffer. As far as the stained area on the backing of the drywall, that had soaked into this very thin cardboard backing, and swabbing it would not have been as effective. And so what I did was I took a sterile scalpel, and I very carefully cut out a small square of the darkest stain on that cardboard backing of the drywall. I put that cutting into a coin envelope, and that coin envelope and the swabbings from the metal parts of the exhibit were forwarded to our DNA unit for DNA testing.
How did you label that cutting that went to the DNA unit for DNA testing, and how did you label the swab that went on for DNA testing?
So the cutting would have been labeled, if I might refer to my notes again.
Please do.
So as far as the metal swabbing, and I only took one of the 4 that I had available to me, I selected one as a representative sample, and the actual stain on the exhibit was exhibit MER3B. And because this was now somewhat of a child of that, this swab was now MER-3B-1. As far as the cutting is concerned, again, it's the same exhibit, so it's going to be exhibit MER-3B. But this was that large stain area, which I called collectively stain 5, but then subcategorized each of the 4 stains in there as A, B, C, and D. And so the stain that went on for, or a portion of it that went on for DNA testing, because I didn't cut the whole stain out. The stain was large enough that I could cut out about a 1-inch square from the middle of it and still leave the rest of it behind. That I identified as MER-3B-5A.
Thank you. The DNA testing that you sent it along for, did you perform that testing yourself or
I
someone
did
else?
not.
Do you remember who that was that did do that testing?
That was performed by my colleague, criminalist Katie Swango.
And finally, Mr. McMahon, with regards to, I know we talked about a couple of specific items. It's my understanding that there were many other items that you swabbed and checked for serology. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And with regards to those, were those either ones where no blood was found or that after a physical examination, there was no stain to test? With regards to the physical items, not hairs. So excuse me, I think anything other than the hairs that you were provided.
So that would be correct. All the other items that I looked at, with maybe the exception of two, either did not find blood on them or my testing of what looked like it could be blood was negative.
And with regards to the two that you thought that you might have located blood, let me ask, was one of them, to your recollection, a sweatshirt or a portion of a sweatshirt?
I think it was a portion of a sweater.
Okay, that's a portion of a sweater. If
Yes.
you could refer to your notes, I just want to make sure that we're clear.
Yes, the two items that I'm referring to are exhibits JP 216, which is a pink sweater, and this is detailed in my report dated April 21st.
And JP 216, so that's the first two initials there are JP. Is that
That's correct.
Okay. And with regards to that sweatshirt, do you know what kind of vehicle that came out of? Whether or not it was an Audi that came out of? Are you aware of that?
I don't know what the source of where the item was collected from, but it's a sweater.
Sweater. Okay. And was there? You said there was one other item. Could you please
Right.
tell us what that one was?
The other one was JP 251, which was a length of twine.
And that also was a JP, I believe you said those initials.
Yes, sir.
Okay. And do you know whether that came out of a blue Audi, or do you, similar to your last answer, you don't know where that item came from?
I do not know.
All right. I can just have a moment, please, Your Honor.
Yes.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
One of the New Hampshire State Lab has a separate DNA lab, right?
That's correct.
And do you do DNA?
I do not.
Okay. And one of the reasons that things don't go directly to DNA is DNA kind of costs a lot of money, and you want to make sure that the testing is of something that may produce a DNA result.
That's correct. The vast majority of evidence that comes to the laboratory with a request to check for blood or semen or saliva typically goes through a serological examination first. And if we find something, usually only a portion of the original item gets forwarded on for DNA testing, not the entire item. We'll cut a stain out of a garment or out of a piece of drywall, like I just explained to you. When I don't find any type of a biological material, then that's where the analysis ends.
Okay.
And nothing would go on to DNA.
Right, because if it doesn't get through you, there's likely not DNA,
That's correct.
and that a DNA test would be a waste.
That's correct.
So that's not always the case that it goes through you, right?
Well, the vast majority of it is the vast majority of the evidence is subjected to some sort of a serological analysis by either myself or a colleague of mine.
Okay.
There are some items that would go straight to DNA, like a known DNA sample of one person or another. There's no need to perform any analysis on an item of evidence, which is a known sample from a known individual.
Okay. I'm going to show you a copy of what's been marked as States Exhibit 10. Have you seen this object before?
I have not.
Okay. And this is a full exhibit, Your Honor. A toothbrush. There's been testimony about DNA tested in the lab and results found on the toothbrush. Why was it that that didn't go through you?
I'm not sure if I can answer that. I could only surmise that for serological or biological testing, the area of interest in that particular item is so small. We're not looking for DNA on the parts of the handle. We're looking for DNA only on the part that goes into the person's mouth and makes contact with their teeth and gums. And that was so small. And the fear would be that there would be very little DNA present because it's a small surface area. And so rather than wasting sample on a serological test, because we're going to do DNA testing regardless, let's just reserve all of the sample for DNA testing. There are a few situations where even though my testing is negative, the item still goes on for DNA testing. And that's a few situations, and it's only done because we recognize that the sensitivity of the test that I perform is much lower than the sensitivity of a DNA test. So when I swab the mouth of a bottle that was left behind at a crime scene, and I test that swabbing for saliva and it's negative, that swabbing would still go on for DNA.
And essentially, we are talking about saliva, and that the area of interest on a toothbrush would be saliva.
That's correct.
And so pretty much no matter what, that's going to the DNA lab.
Yes, ma'am.
And so this isn't simply a procedure where people are doing things by rote. You actually consider the possibility of whether testing might consume DNA before DNA can actually be tested.
That's correct.
And if there's the possibility of that, you're going to send it straight for testing so that your tests don't consume or have any effect on the DNA that might be present.
That's correct.
To make sure that if it's there, it's going to be found.
Yes, ma'am.
So there, you had some testimony about JMT evidence, starting with the initials JMT.
Yes, ma'am.
And that was a section of black carpet, a child's t-shirt, and a child's pajama pants, right? Go ahead.
Yes,
Okay. And those, I think you were aware, were found in the trunk of a car?
I believe so. Yes.
Okay. And the same area where the toothbrush was found?
That I'm not sure I was aware of at the time.
Okay. And so you tested each of these items and they were all negative for blood.
That's correct.
And you talked about the testing, that if you saw a stain that looked like it might be blood, then you would take the next step and do some screening with the chemical.
That's correct.
In the black carpet, because a stain might be there and you might miss it, you do extra tests, right?
Right. That's when we re-examine the item using the infrared light source. That's correct.
So you don't assume, okay, I can't see anything. You're going to make sure that it's not there.
That's only done when the color of the substrate, the surface that possible blood is on, is dark enough that it might, by virtue of its dark color, interfere with my ability to see the blood stain. Items that are lighter colored, it would just get a standard physical examination under normal room lighting.
So the next step after you question, perhaps there's something there, you do that Castle
Mayor.
Testing. And the black section of carpet from the trunk was negative for blood. The child's t-shirt, you checked that for, you examined it by sight to check for stains, right?
That's correct.
And you found several.
Yes.
And you tested them to see if those stains were just child stains or blood.
Well, I'm not sure I would describe it that way, but there are a number of stains on a green sweatshirt.
Turquoise, perhaps?
Okay. I wasn't exactly sure which one you were speaking about.
All right, JMT5.
Okay. I was thinking of another item, but yeah, I conducted an examination of it. Again, if I might refer to my notes. I conducted a physical examination of this child's t-shirt, and because the sleeves of the t-shirt were dark blue, the body of the shirt was this turquoise, I conducted an additional physical exam using the infrared light source and looking for additional staining on the sleeves.
And so that was negative for the presence of blood.
That's correct.
And then there was a child's pajama pants found in the same area.
That's correct.
And
Well, I'm not sure where it was
the
collected
location,
from.
okay, sorry. JMT 6, that one, you didn't have to go to the Castle-Meyer testing, right?
I did not.
Because you could see the item well enough to determine if there were stains characteristic of blood.
Well, in this case, like some of the other items, these pajama pants were dark gray in color. And so after examining them under normal room lighting, I conducted a re-examination using the infrared light source, and I didn't find any staining on these pajama pants at all.
So it's pretty fair to say that if there's a question in your mind, you take another step.
If one is available.
So then you did several items that had the initials at the beginning JP.
Yes,
And there's been testimony before you that JP would, and you understand that the initials reflect the officer that has collected and bagged or whatever the evidence.
I do. That's a common practice in law enforcement.
And there has been testimony that that was JP referred to an Officer Pittman. And these items were from the Audi. Were you aware of that?
At that time, no.
Okay. And same sort of testing to determine whether or not there was a presence of blood.
That's correct.
And if there was a question in your observation, you would take the next step and check for either a light source or the Castle-Meyer.
That's correct.
And the results were a little bit mixed. Some you did not find the presence of blood.